Kilgore was, an oil town, a very nice area, wholesome families. Everybody kind of knew everybody, and football was a big thing, being in Texas. At the Kilgore KFC restaurant, our biggest day of the week would be Friday, because before the football games, mothers didn't have time to cook. The whole town was busy, busy, busy. Everybody was just gearing up for the big football night. My shift was from 11 to 7. I left and went home.
It's shortly before 12 a.m. KFC manager Leanne Raspberry is unwinding after her shift when the phone rings.
It was from the Kilgore Police Department that they were at the restaurant and that something wasn't right.
When she arrives at the restaurant, police tell Leanne what happened after she'd punched out. Assistant Manager Mary Tyler was about to close up for the night when her daughter, Kim Miller, came by for a visit.
When Kim got there, she had noticed the front door being locked, so she went around the back. The back door was wide open. Then nobody's there.
My stepsister found the place disarray. She immediately called my dad to see if Mary was at home.
At the end of every shift, Mary would deposit the day's cash in the bank.
Dad told her Mary wasn't there, and then they both were calling hospitals, emergency rooms to make sure there was no accident. Once they found out Mary wasn't in the ER, that's when he said, okay, let's call the police department.
Mary was a dear friend. We shared a lot of time together at work, and we talked a lot on the phone. She was a single mom for several years, and she would talk about working extra hours just to have enough to maybe buy something one of the kids needed for school. And she struggled, I'm sure, because I was a single mom myself. And then Mary married Billy Tyler. And it was so sweet to see them together because she was about 5'2" and he was probably 6'2". She just loved it when he came in the restaurant, and he was pretty crazy about her.
I don't know what drew my dad and Mary together, but he says that she was the love of his life. We were from divorced parents, didn't have a mom around for a while. And then Mary came in the picture, and it was a family.
She already had 3 kids of her own, Tony, him, and Bubba, but had no problem taking in 2 more.
Mary was as proud of them as if they were her biological children. She would just brag on them and say what neat things they had done. And her son was probably 7 at the time. He was handicapped. He had some disabilities, and she just, oh Lord, she loved that boy. And he loved his mother.
Even though she'd work a day shift at the Kentucky Fried Chicken, she'd come home and she'd cook a meal, and we talked during dinner.
She took us underneath her wings, just like we were her own.
We were hers.
An officer walked with me through the restaurant, I guess, to get a picture of what may have happened. All the money had been taken out of the registers, and there was a good bit of blood kind of spattered, and things were scattered like there had been a struggle. Well, the police were curious to know who should be there, so we went and looked at the time cards.
When police check Mary's time card, they find she hadn't punched out for the night. Neither had her co-workers, 20-year-old Joey Johnson and 39-year-old mother of three, Opie Hughes.
Their vehicles were there, but they weren't. My gut you hear people say my heart failed. That's what it was. It was fear.
Police are about to start a search for the missing employees when a young woman arrives in a panic. She says her husband, David Maxwell, is missing.
David Maxwell was also an employee of the Kentucky Fried Chicken and was a frat brother with Joey Johnson. Lana informed law enforcement that David had gone up to the KFC to meet up with Joey when he got off work, along with another frat brother, Monty Landers. David and Monty had been hanging out in the restaurant waiting for Joey to get off.
We found out that Monty Landers and David Maxwell were also missing. I was in disbelief. It was a void and a hollowness and a fear for their safety. We waited for them all night at the police station thinking they're okay and they're going to get to a phone and, they're going to be found.
An employee of an oil field out in rural Rusk County, 12 or so miles from the KFC restaurant, was driving to the wells when he sees 4 people lying next to the road.
And so he yells at them to get up, thinking maybe there's just been some sort of party and these people have fallen asleep. He walks up there and realizes that they're dead.
A man was in rural Rusk County checking his oil derricks when he sees 4 people lying next to the road. He goes up to them and discovers that they are all 4 deceased.
Investigators determined fairly quickly that these are the folks who matched the description from the Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant in Kilgore. A couple of them were wearing uniforms, but there are only 4 of them.
They were in a row from left to right. They are identified as Joey, Mary, David, and Monty. They were all lying on their stomachs with their heads on their hands. They were shot in the back of the head or in the back multiple times apiece. This was an execution.
Police spread out looking for evidence. They soon find the 5th victim, Opie Hughes.
She too was lying on her stomach and was shot multiple times. The theory was that she had tried to run.
and so they called upon the assistance of the Texas Rangers. They are essentially Texas' version of the Bureau of Investigation.
There was very little evidence at the scene. Their bodies and the bullets, and that was it.
Investigators are baffled. 5 people brought to a remote oil field 12 miles from where they were abducted were lined up and murdered. It shocks even the most veteran detectives.
Mass murder on that scale in '83 was just unthinkable. It was just beyond the pale of anything that they had ever envisioned.
When I found out what had taken place, I don't even know how I absorbed it. It was like my world just fell apart. At KFC, we were kind of like family. That was our social life outside of our home. And we had watched each other's children grow up and were involved in each other's lives. And I couldn't help but feel just awful that Mary's children wouldn't ever see her again. And Opie's children. It's just hard to imagine that.
I remember my dad getting a phone call, and I remember him going outside and just kind of breaking down on his truck. And then the next thing I can remember is Kim, my stepsister, pulling into the driveway, and she was in hysterics. She couldn't stop her car. So I remember someone like kind of slipping into the driver's side window and like pulling the emergency brake.
The investigation starts at the last place all 5 victims were seen, the KFC.
Texas Ranger Glenn Elliott is looking at things and notices a box lid with a distinctive blood spatter pattern. Blood spatter science is just starting to take off. And he believes that it's high velocity and that somebody's been hit and that blood's moved that way and hit that box lid. And in the back room, there's a napkin, and he forms the opinion that was cast off blood, just like somebody had had a bloody nose or something. And so that did interest that ranger, but it didn't necessarily interest most officers at the time. Fingerprint was the science of the day in 1983, and so they were really going heavy with fingerprint dust and trying to lift prints from cash register, from the counter, from everywhere.
Each of the 5 victims was taken to Dallas for autopsy. They were able to determine that at least 2 different weapons were used, a .38 and a .357. And there could have possibly been a 3rd weapon because there were several different kinds of bullets. So they knew that they were looking for at least 2 shooters, possibly 3.
The medical examiner begins the autopsies for all 5 victims.
When they were doing Joey's autopsy, a fingernail fell out of the waistband of his jeans. And he did not have any torn fingernails.
And the ranger was convinced that this must belong to the killer. And so they're immediately looking for this person who may be missing a fingernail.
The day that it actually set in with Denise and I was the day of her funeral. Then we realized Mary is not coming home.
I remember Davy's funeral, carrying his casket, and there's still this disbelief. This hadn't happened. I first met David. I can't remember exactly if it was 8th or 9th grade. David was a new guy in school, and he was just a laid-back guy. He laughed a lot.
David was very kind, considerate. He was married to a sweet girl and had just found out that they were pregnant and was over the moon, just living life large.
And then I remember the funeral ending. It was back to this, why aren't they doing something? Why hadn't there been an arrest made? The events that happened are almost like an anchor that drew me in the direction of law enforcement. Made a decision to go to the academy to become a police officer.
Law enforcement were talking to all of the ne'er-do-wells in town. Jim Earl Mankins Jr. was just generally kind of known as one of the local troublemakers. His father was a former state legislator who was very well respected, Jim Earl Mankins Sr., but Jr. had problems with the law for a number of years. He was a known drug dealer.
They bring Jimmy Mankins Jr. in to be questioned. He willingly comes in, does a non-custodial interview, and they end up examining his hands because they already have the lead of the fingernail.
And that's when they noticed that the middle finger on his right hand, the fingernail was torn all the way down to the quick.
That KFC restaurant reopened, and I was scared. You were jumpy and nervous, and several employees quit. I would think about all of them all the time. Often, something would trigger a memory. Sometimes somebody will say something funny that makes you think about Joey. He was a prankster, and people saying, "Oh, Joey," and it was extremely hard.
As loved ones say their last goodbyes, detectives get their first solid lead. A missing fingernail on the hand of 30-year-old Jim Earl Mankins Jr.
Law enforcement took a whole bunch of pictures of his finger, and then they took a clipping of that same fingernail after it had grown out.
In 1983, the prevailing view in the forensic scientific community was that fingernails were distinctive, just like fingerprints, and they'd be able to look on the underside of the fingernail and see what they refer to as striations through a microscope.
Investigators send the clippings to a Dallas lab, where techs can compare them to the fingernail found on Joey Johnson during his autopsy. They also dig deeper into Mankins.
On the date of the murders, Jimmy Mankins Jr. just gotten out of jail for unlawfully having a weapon.
The weapon was confiscated, and he borrowed another weapon, a .38 as I recall, from one of his friends. And there was a .38 that was believed to be one of the murder weapons. And the ballistics guys told him, "I can't say this .38 is any more the gun that killed these people than any other .38 on earth." But, him having a .38 definitely moved him up in the category of people that law enforcement was interested in.
When this all occurred, there was lots of rumors that drugs were being sold out of the drive-through window at the Kentucky Fried Chicken and that someone at the restaurant had a drug recipe.
There were rumors that hidden somewhere inside that KFC was the recipe for high-grade methamphetamine.
I had heard that Jimmy Mankins wanted the recipe, and that was why it had happened.
The FBI joined into this investigation fairly early on because there were thoughts of drug involvement. The agent who worked the case for the FBI was George Keeney.
The tips and rumors about Mankins are soon backed up with physical evidence when those fingernail comparisons come in.
They make a confirmation, yes, this fingernail clipping that we've discovered matches this known individual.
While investigators build their case against Mankins, a tipster offers Texas Ranger Glenn Elliott solid information that kickstarts a parallel investigation.
Star Powers was her name. And on the night of the murders, Star came in to the KFC just a few minutes before closing time. She saw an employee on the phone right by the counter, and she heard her say, "Somebody didn't make the deposit today. There's $2,000 in here." And Star remembered thinking to herself, "Oh, she shouldn't say that out loud." And she noticed that there were two men immediately behind her. And she thought that they heard the same thing.
There's an unusually large amount of money in the restaurant, and it certainly would have looked like a quick, easy score. Maybe this is a target of opportunity.
What Star Powers told Ranger Elliott was certainly consistent with there being an armed robbery that was maybe just a crime of opportunity.
Powers describes the men she'd seen at the KFC, and the Rangers reach out to local police jurisdictions, hoping one of them can identify these men.
The then Smith County Sheriff had a lot of confidential informants in the Smith County Jail, and he's the one that developed the lead and took it to the Rangers and said, "You need to look at these guys, Darnell Hartsfield and Romeo Pinkerton." There was a warrant out for Darnell Hartsfield for committing an armed robbery in Tyler 3 days after the KFC.
The grocery store robbery happened only 30 miles from Kilgore and had striking similarities to the KFC crime.
It was close to closing time. They had weapons. They got all of the money out of the register, all the petty cash money, everywhere they could get money, and they made the women stay laying with their heads on their hands until they got away.
The Texas Rangers put together a wanted poster that includes Romeo Pinkerton and Darnell Hartsfield, wanted for connection and questioning with the Kentucky Fried Chicken robbery.
There were obviously efforts to question them, but at the time, Hartsfield had not been apprehended.
Investigators tracked down his presumed accomplice, Romeo Pinkerton.
Romeo Pinkerton's alibi is that he was still in prison at the time that it happened, so he couldn't have done it.
He was only released from prison a couple of days after the KFC robbery and murders.
After searching for several weeks, Tyler police find Darnell Hartsfield and charge him with the grocery store robbery.
Ranger Dowell interviewed Darnell Hartsfield after he was apprehended.
Though the two crimes are similar, Hartsfield insists he had nothing to do with the KFC murders.
He polygraphed him, as they did with, almost 100 people probably. And he passed the polygraph, and so he was done at that point.
So they quit studying him. That just became a dead end.
All of law enforcement continued to believe that if they kept working it from the Mencken's drug angle, eventually things would break open more.
There has to be some sort of justification to take the lives of 5 people. To say that it was a robbery over such a small amount of money seems so horribly mean.
They got a ton of tips. Things developed from a bunch of different sources, and they all circulated around the idea that it was Mencken's. They did all kinds of things to try to develop additional evidence. I mean, there was a period of time Mencken's was in prison subsequent to the crime, and they wired his cellmate up to get recordings, and they never got anything meaningful.
The fingernail linking Mencken's to the torn nail found on Joey Johnson is the only real evidence police have against Mencken's, and it's not enough to bring a murder charge. The case goes as cold as the barren ground where these 5 victims were discovered.
It was agonizing. Nothing was being accomplished. And Denise and I did what we could. We pushed the issue. Call and push and write letters and say, hey, something's got to be done.
These people were still out there. It could happen to someone else's family.
On the 10-year anniversary of the crime, there was a lot of press, a lot of media, and the victims' family members went to the local district attorney and asked him to call in the Attorney General's office for assistance.
I called every week. I called twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week. And I'm sure they got tired of me calling.
DA Kyle Freeman felt a commitment to these families to get the case solved.
Prosecutor Kyle Freeman asks Texas Attorney General Dan Morales for help.
Dan Morales makes a commitment to solving the case, and he does devote a lot of resources.
In the 10 years since the murders, there have been major advances in forensic science. Investigators will use those advances to take a new look at the fingernail found on Joey Johnson.
When you're dealing with evidence, it has to be conclusive, it has to be tangible. And DNA at that time was becoming such a big word.
The fingernail was submitted to a lab in Dallas for DNA testing that was state-of-the-art at the time, and they did get one result that was consistent with Mencken's.
It's enough for the DA to convene a grand jury to weigh the evidence against Mencken's.
They were attempting to reach an indictment for Jim Earl Mencken's, and I was called as a witness. And there was a sense of relief that finally something something finally good, because there had been nothing.
Prosecutors take 7 weeks to present their evidence to the grand jury. And finally, this cold case thaws out.
Mankins was indicted and booked for the 5 killings as investigators gathered enough evidence for prosecutors to convince a jury he did it.
We were finally getting somewhere. It looked like it was a beginning to an end.
Mankins waits in jail for his day in court. Prosecutors hope to strengthen their case against him with ironclad forensic evidence.
Eventually, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology was brought in. They were the top-of-the-line, state-of-the-art lab in the world. We were scheduled for a conference call with the lab, and we were all around this big table, and the DNA analyst got on the phone and she said, "Okay, I have results." And we were all looking at the speakerphone, and she said, "Yeah, it's not his nail." You could just hear a pin drop.
All of a sudden, the charges are dropped. I remember just being angry. You kind of lay your hope on something, and you can begin some process of getting some healing, of families moving forward.
After 6 months behind bars, Jim Earl Mankins Jr. is set free.
Everybody was thinking that because of who his dad was, the state representative for the state of Texas, that his daddy was helping him out of it. His dad was keeping stuff hush-hush.
How you gonna cover something up with FBI agents, with Texas Rangers, with highway patrolmen, then you got county law, then you got city law. I mean, that's a lot of cover. I mean, there's no way.
The case against Mankins was based mostly on that fingernail, and without it, the case goes cold once more.
We just went back to pushing again, calling, writing letters, and doing what we could. You know, this day and age is, different from back then. Is there anything that y'all can do different now that y'all could have done?
When I was elected sheriff in 1996, I would think about it off and on. I guess I accepted that it was a cold case. That day I met George Keeney, who was a retired FBI agent. That completely changed. Matter of fact, everything changed. I would think about David anytime I drove through Kilgore. Every time I saw that KFC, it just brought back thoughts. It just over and over and over again. I just felt a desire for justice. Somebody did this. Somebody needs to pay up.
Stroud gives the case another jump start. He brings in retired FBI agent George Keeney, who'd worked the case back in the 1980s.
We agreed the best thing to do was just to take fresh eyes and begin looking at everything again.
Retired FBI agent George Keeney applies new forensic techniques to old evidence from the restaurant. He tests a bloodstained napkin and a cashier's tape box, looking for a link to the killer or killers.
The blood on the cardboard box that had held the cash register tape came back to be consistent with a Darnell Hartsfield. And the blood on the napkin with Romeo Pinkerton.
Both men were suspects back in 1983, but were cleared.
Romeo Pinkerton claimed that he was only released from prison a couple of days after the KFC robbery and murders, and his claim was based on a hurricane, that it was not until after this hurricane had gone through. So it made sense. In hindsight, you weren't able to check things as quickly back then because there wasn't the internet. They were able to check the records, and he was actually released from prison a couple of days before the KFC murders.
We had a meeting with all 5 families shortly after the hits came in, and once I pulled the wanted poster out and showed them, several members of the family started to cry because you saw the realization that these guys had been there all along, and we just didn't have the science to prove it.
Looking for more, investigators take a closer look at the victim's clothing.
And that's when they use the black light, and they're able to determine that there appears to be semen in Opie Hughes's pants.
That was a huge epiphany for us. Law enforcement had early on explained away her being away from everybody else by saying, well, she's the one who tried to run.
Finding out that Opie had been raped was like getting hit by a train. I never saw that coming, and my heart just broke. Opie was the kindest, gentlest person. She wouldn't hurt a flea. And it's almost like they took the most innocent. I couldn't even process it for a long time.
We submitted cuttings from her pants to the lab for DNA analysis. The lab called and said, the DNA result doesn't match Pinkerton or Hartsfield. We just all looked at each other and just thought, oh God, here we go again. There's a third person that's out there.
We had a DNA profile. Surely we're going to be able to find this individual.
The DNA doesn't match anyone involved, including Opie's husband or their original suspect, Jim Earl Mankins Jr.
Well, there was no evidence to tie Mankins to it. For so many years, they believed the case is solved. This person did it. Well, they didn't do it. This striation science really didn't hold up in hindsight, and I submit that science has proven incorrect, and again, took this case down the wrong path for many, many years, unfortunately.
Today, a Rusk County grand jury handed down 10 capital murder indictments, 5 each against Darnell Hartsfield and Romeo Pinkerton.
To avoid the death penalty, Pinkerton takes a deal and pleads guilty to 5 counts of murder. The judge hands down 5 life sentences. Hartsfield decides to take his chances with the jury. During his trial, prosecutors describe what they believe happened on that horrible night back in 1983.
I believe they were there as customers in the restaurant, and they overhear that the deposit hadn't been made. They go out to make a quick, easy score by coming back when the restaurant closes up. And Joey Johnson, the cook that night, is taking out the trash in the back and forcing them back into the restaurant to let them in. And somehow inside, there ends up being a struggle in the restaurant.
And that's where it was a robbery that just went bad. And I think that felt like they had no choice but to eliminate the victims. Darnell Hartsfield was convicted of all 5 capital murders, and he was sentenced to life in prison for capital murder. Efforts to identify the third person are ongoing.
So many people over the years have made a commitment that until they leave this world, they will keep searching for the truth and for that final person.
Yes, they've gotten 2. Okay. But there's still a part of us that's not able to move forward because there's no closure.
It hurts. It's not each individual victim. I think of him sort of like a family. They each had each other that night. And so when the Hughes don't have that closure, we don't have that closure. But it's coming. It may not be today, may not even be tomorrow or a week from now, but it's coming.
There are cases that shock a city because of what happened in a single night. And then there are cases that become almost impossible to comprehend because of how long they continued before anyone understood what was happening. In Houston, Texas, during the early 1970s, young people were disappearing one by one. A teenager would leave home and fail to return. Another would vanish somewhere across the city. Families waited. They searched. They asked questions. And in many cases, they were left with the same unbearable uncertainty. Where was their child? For years, those disappearances did not appear to form one story. They seemed like separate tragedies, separated by time, distance, and circumstance. There was no modern network of smartphones, widespread surveillance cameras, digital tracking systems, or DNA databases capable of immediately connecting missing person cases. A teenager who did not come home could be difficult to trace, particularly when different families, neighborhoods, and investigators were dealing with different circumstances. But behind many of those disappearances was one man. His name was Dean Arnold Corll. Later known as the Candyman Killer, Corll became associated with one of the most disturbing series of killings in Houston's history. Between approximately 1970 and 1973, he targeted boys, teenagers, and young men in the Houston area and nearby locations. He did not operate entirely alone. 2 teenagers, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., became important figures in the story, helping Corll gain access to some of the young victims. Yet the full truth would not emerge through a conventional police breakthrough. It would emerge after Corll was dead. That is what makes this case so difficult to understand. The man at the center of the investigation would never stand trial. He would never sit in a courtroom and answer questions from prosecutors. He would never hear the names of the victims read aloud in judgment against him. Instead, on August 8, 1973, Corll was shot and killed by Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. during a confrontation at a house in Pasadena. At first, that event could have appeared to be an isolated killing. It was not. Henley began telling police what he knew, and investigators were led toward locations connected to Corll. What they discovered transformed the investigation almost immediately. The case expanded from the death of one man into an investigation involving numerous missing young people and multiple locations where human remains were found. The scale was difficult to grasp. The number of identified victims associated with the case is commonly given as at least 28, with some accounts referring to 29 depending on how unidentified cases and remains are counted. Behind that number were individual lives, individual families, and individual futures that had disappeared long before investigators understood that the cases could be connected. That distinction matters. It is easy, decades later, to remember a number. 28. 29. But numbers do not disappear from bedrooms at night. Numbers do not leave parents waiting by the door. Numbers do not have friends who wonder why someone never called again. Each victim had a name, a family, relationships, routines, and a life that existed before the investigation ever began. The tragedy of the Coral case, therefore, cannot be understood only through the actions of the man responsible. It must also be understood through the lives of the young people who vanished, and through the families who were forced to live with unanswered questions. Some families waited for years. Some victims were not identified until much later. One example was Stephen Sickman, who disappeared in 1972 and was not confirmed as a victim through DNA identification until 2011. His case demonstrates something important about the aftermath of the Houston killings. Discovering the truth in 1973 did not mean that every family immediately received an answer. For some, the investigation continued across decades. And even today, the case contains unanswered questions. There are references to unidentified remains and continuing efforts to establish the identities of people who may have been connected to the killings. In that sense, the investigation did not simply end when Coral died. His death opened the door to the truth, but it did not instantly close every question surrounding the missing. To understand why the case remained hidden for so long, we have to return to Houston in the early 1970s. It was a growing city, and its neighborhoods contained thousands of ordinary lives unfolding at once. Teenagers moved between homes, schools, workplaces, and friends. Families did not have the communication tools that are considered normal today. When someone disappeared, information could travel slowly. A missing teenager might be treated as an individual case rather than part of a larger pattern. And patterns are often invisible until someone knows what to look for. That is perhaps the most haunting element of the Dean Coral case. The warning signs were not necessarily absent. They were scattered. A disappearance here. Another disappearance there. A family waiting for news. Another family asking the same questions. But without the complete picture, each fragment could remain isolated. Dean Coral understood the vulnerability of that environment. He was an adult living within a community, not a mysterious figure appearing from nowhere. His connection to young people, combined with the involvement of Brooks and Henley, created a network through which victims could be approached and brought into contact with him. For years, that network remained hidden. Then, on one August day in 1973, it began to collapse. Coral's death was not the conclusion of the story. It was the beginning of the investigation that would finally force Houston to confront what had been happening beneath the surface of its ordinary streets. And as investigators followed the information provided after Coral's death, they would discover that the missing teenagers were not isolated cases at all. They were pieces of the same story. A story that had been unfolding for years. A story that many families had been living without knowing its terrible connection. And a story whose full dimensions would only become visible after the man at its center could no longer speak for himself. To understand the Dean Coral case, it is necessary to begin with the people who disappeared. The name Dean Coral became known because of what investigators eventually discovered. But the victims did not begin their lives as names in a criminal investigation. They were sons, brothers, friends, students, workers, and young people whose families expected them to come home. That is where the real story begins. Houston in the early 1970s was a city in motion. It was growing, changing, and expanding, with people moving through neighborhoods and communities every day. For teenagers, ordinary life often meant a great deal of independence. They could leave home to visit friends, go to work, spend time in their neighborhoods, or travel across the city without the constant communication that families take for granted today. There were no smartphones to call home from the street. There was no location sharing to show where someone had gone. There was no digital record automatically connecting one disappearance with another. When a young person failed to return home, a family could be left with very little information. At first, the disappearance might appear to be isolated. One teenager was missing. Another young person disappeared weeks or months later. Then another. But behind those separate disappearances was a developing pattern. Dean Coral was living in the Houston area during this period. He was not operating as a solitary figure, completely disconnected from the people around him. Two teenagers, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., became significant parts of the story. Brooks knew Coral from an early stage. His involvement became important because he could help create connections between Coral and younger people. Henley later became another important participant. That fact changes the way the case has to be understood. Coral was not simply a stranger approaching every victim without assistance or connection. The presence of younger people around him could make contact easier and could create a sense of familiarity for those who encountered him. For the young people who disappeared, that distinction mattered. A person they encountered might not initially appear to be dangerous. A connection could come through someone they already knew. Trust could exist before anyone realized that trust had been placed in the wrong person. The evidence that emerged after Coral's death indicated that Brooks and Henley played different roles in the events surrounding him. Their involvement would later become central to the investigation and to the legal proceedings that followed. But before the investigation reached that stage, there were families simply waiting. Waiting is one of the most difficult elements of a missing person case. When there is no confirmed death, there is also no final answer. Hope remains, even when that hope becomes painful. A family may wonder whether the missing person left voluntarily, whether something happened on the road, whether someone knows more than they are saying, or whether the person might suddenly return. For the families connected to the Coral case, that uncertainty could last for years. The later discovery of human remains would provide answers for some, but those answers came at an enormous emotional cost. The investigation eventually demonstrated that the disappearances were connected to a much larger pattern than anyone had initially understood. At least 28 victims are commonly associated with the case, while some accounts refer to 29 depending on how unidentified cases and remains are counted. That number is often repeated because it conveys the scale of the crimes. But the number can also hide the individuality of the victims. Every disappearance represented a separate household becoming incomplete. A bedroom that remained empty. A family that continued asking questions. A friend who remembered the last time they had seen someone. A name that remained on a missing person list. And sometimes, a family that waited decades before receiving confirmation. Stephen Sickman is one example of how long that uncertainty could last. He disappeared in 1972, during the period when Coral's crimes were still taking place. His remains were eventually identified through DNA testing in 2011. Nearly 4 decades had passed. By then, the world had changed. Technology had changed. Investigative methods had changed. But the fundamental question had remained the same: what happened to him? His identification illustrates one of the most important realities of the case. The discovery of Coral's crimes in 1973 did not instantly resolve every disappearance connected to him. The investigation could establish a broad pattern, but individual identities still had to be determined. Some victims could be connected to missing person reports. Others required later forensic work. And some questions remained unresolved. That is why the story cannot be reduced to the period between 1970 and 1973. The events occurred during those years, but their consequences continued long afterward. For investigators in 1973, however, the immediate challenge was much more basic. They had to understand what they were looking at. The turning point came through Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. Henley had become involved with Coral while still a teenager. His relationship with Coral eventually deteriorated into the confrontation that ended Coral's life on August 8, 1973. Henley shot Coral during that confrontation. The significance of that moment became clear only afterward. If Coral had remained alive, the investigation might have developed differently. Instead, the person at the center of the suspected killings was dead before investigators could question him in court. Henley became one of the principal sources of information about what had happened. His statements led investigators toward locations connected to Coral. What they encountered there began changing the entire understanding of the case. The investigation moved beyond a single homicide. There were locations where remains had been buried, including a boat shed area in Houston and other sites in southeastern Texas, including an area near Lake Sam Rayburn. The more investigators uncovered, the more clearly the missing person cases began to connect. The question was no longer simply who had killed Dean Coral. The question became much larger. Who were all of these young people? How many had disappeared? How long had the activity continued? And how many families had been searching for answers without realizing that their cases were connected? Those questions transformed the investigation into what became known as the Houston mass murders. The phrase itself carried a weight that was difficult to comprehend. For years, young people had vanished individually. Now investigators were looking at multiple victims connected to the same man. The timeline stretched across several years. The victims were not all taken at the same time. Their disappearances were separated by months and circumstances. That separation had been one of the reasons the pattern remained hidden. The case therefore raises an uncomfortable question about how society recognizes danger. Sometimes danger does not announce itself as one enormous event. Sometimes it appears as a series of small events that seem unrelated until someone finally places them side by side. One family reports a missing son. Another family reports another. A third family waits. The individual cases may not immediately resemble one another. But once investigators began examining the evidence surrounding Coral, those separate stories started moving toward the same center. And that center was a man who had lived within the community while maintaining a hidden world that few people understood. The role of Brooks made the situation even more complicated. He had known Coral and had become involved in helping him reach younger people. He was not simply someone who accidentally learned about Coral's activities after everything was over. His involvement meant that there were people around Coral who had information that could potentially have exposed him earlier. Yet the crimes continued. That reality raises another difficult question. How much did people know? And when did they know it? The answer is not simple. Knowing that something is wrong is not always the same as understanding its full meaning. A person may witness something disturbing without recognizing the larger pattern. Another person may know more but remain silent. Someone else may never realize that an event they considered ordinary was connected to something much more serious. The Coral case demonstrates how secrecy can survive inside ordinary surroundings. There was no dramatic warning that told Houston a major investigation was about to unfold. There were simply missing young people. And then suddenly there was a dead man named Dean Coral. After his death, investigators began uncovering the connections that had been invisible before. The names of missing teenagers could now be compared with evidence recovered from locations associated with Coral. Families who had waited for answers began to receive information. Some would finally learn what had happened to their children. Others would wait much longer. And some identities would remain uncertain. The investigation was beginning to reconstruct a story that had been fragmented for years. But the most disturbing realization was still ahead. The disappearances had not been random incidents occurring across an enormous city. They were connected to a network involving Coral and two younger accomplices. And the person who ultimately opened that network to investigators was not a detective, not a prosecutor, and not a forensic specialist. It was Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., one of the young men who had himself become involved with Coral. That contradiction would become central to the entire case. Henley had participated in the world surrounding Coral. Then, on August 8, 1973, he ended Coral's life. And by doing so, he exposed a secret that had remained hidden for years. The discovery would force Houston to look backward. Investigators would have to revisit disappearances that had once seemed separate. They would have to identify remains, compare records, and determine which missing young people were connected to Coral. For the families, the process was not an abstract investigation. It was personal. Every newly identified victim represented another household confronting a truth that had once seemed impossible. The young people who had vanished were no longer simply missing. They were part of a much larger tragedy. And the more investigators learned, the clearer it became that the greatest mystery was not only how Dean Coral had committed so many crimes. It was how long the pattern had remained hidden in plain sight. That question would follow the investigation from the first discoveries in 1973 into the decades that came afterward. Because even when the central figure was dead, the case was far from over. The investigation had only just begun. By August 1973, Dean Coral had managed to keep the most disturbing part of his life hidden for years. The disappearances continued to exist as separate stories, carried by families who did not know that their children might be connected to one another. The larger pattern had not yet become visible. Then came August 8th. That day changed everything. Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., still a teenager, went to a house in Pasadena where Coral was present. What happened there ended with Henley shooting Coral. The man who had stood at the center of the hidden network was dead. But the shooting was only the beginning. Coral would never be questioned by detectives. He would never explain his relationships with Brooks and Henley. He would never identify the young people who had disappeared or explain what had happened to them. Instead, investigators had to reconstruct the truth from the information left behind and from the statements of people who had been connected to him. Henley became one of the most important sources of information. The initial investigation could easily have remained focused on Coral's death. A man had been shot. The shooter was known. The immediate circumstances appeared to involve a confrontation between two people. But Henley's information opened a completely different path. Investigators were directed toward locations associated with Coral. Those locations included a boat shed area in Houston and other sites in southeastern Texas, including an area near Lake Sam Rayburn. What investigators found there changed the nature of the case. The evidence indicated that Coral was connected to numerous missing young people. What had initially looked like a single homicide was becoming an investigation into a series of deaths. The scale was shocking. Investigators began recovering human remains from locations connected to the information they had received. Each discovery created another question. Who was the person? When had that person disappeared? Was the disappearance already recorded? Had the family reported it? Could the remains be connected to someone whose loved ones had been waiting for years? The investigation became an exercise in reconstruction. There was no single document containing the entire story. There was no complete list waiting to be opened. Instead, investigators had to assemble the pieces. A missing person report could provide one clue. Information connected to Coral could provide another. Physical evidence from a location could create another connection. The names of young people who had disappeared over several years now had to be compared with what investigators were uncovering. And as those pieces came together, the number of possible victims grew. The case became known as the Houston mass murders. That name reflected something investigators were beginning to understand. This was not one isolated tragedy. It was a pattern. The disappearances had occurred over a period of years. They had not happened all at once. That fact was important because it helped explain why the crimes had remained hidden. If 20 or 30 young people had disappeared on the same night, the connection would have been obvious. But they did not. One disappeared. Then another. Then another. The time between cases allowed each disappearance to exist within its own circumstances. Families did not necessarily know one another. Investigators did not immediately have evidence connecting the cases. And without modern technology, establishing relationships between separate missing person investigations was considerably more difficult. The investigation now had to move backward through time. Who had disappeared first? Who had last been seen with whom? Which missing young people had connections to Coral, Brooks, or Henley? Which remains could be identified? And which identities remained uncertain? These questions were not merely investigative details. Each answer had consequences for a family. For years, some relatives had lived with uncertainty. A missing child creates a unique kind of grief because the absence does not come with certainty. There is no final explanation. There is only an empty space and the possibility that something might still change. The discoveries connected to Coral began replacing uncertainty with something far more painful. For some families, investigators could finally provide an answer. Their child had not simply disappeared. Their child had become one of the victims associated with the Coral case. For others, the process was slower. The remains recovered during the investigation could not always be immediately identified. Establishing a person's identity required comparison with existing records and, in some cases, investigative work that would continue long after 1973. The case of Stephen Sickman demonstrates how long that process could last. Sickman disappeared in 1972, during the period in which Coral was active. His remains were eventually identified through DNA testing in 2011. The distance between those two dates is difficult to comprehend. Nearly 4 decades separated the disappearance from the scientific confirmation of his identity. For his family, the investigation did not end when Coral died. The truth continued to unfold across generations of investigative technology. This is one of the reasons the Coral case cannot be understood only as a historical crime from the early 1970s. Its consequences continued. The discovery of the remains also forced investigators to confront the question of how many victims were involved. The commonly cited total is at least 28 victims, while some accounts use the figure 29 depending on how unidentified cases and remains are counted. But even that number did not necessarily represent the absolute end of the investigation. There were unidentified remains. There were missing person cases. There were questions about whether every person connected to Coral had been identified. And there were locations whose significance continued to be examined. The investigators were therefore facing 2 separate tasks. The first was to establish what had happened. The second was to determine who had been affected. Those tasks are not always the same. Finding evidence that a crime occurred does not automatically reveal the identity of every victim. Identifying a victim does not necessarily explain every detail of that person's disappearance. The investigation had to proceed one piece at a time. And at the center of those pieces was the relationship between Coral, Brooks, and Henley. David Owen Brooks had known Coral and played a significant role in helping him gain access to younger people. Henley had also become involved while still a teenager. Their presence complicated the simple image of a solitary offender. Coral had not existed in complete isolation. He had relationships. He had people around him. And at least some of those people knew things about his behavior that could have been important to investigators. That raises one of the most difficult questions in the entire case. Why did the truth remain hidden for so long? There was no single answer. The technology of the period was limited compared with modern investigations. Missing person records were not connected through the kind of digital systems that investigators use today. There were no smartphones providing constant communication or location data. Surveillance cameras were not part of everyday life in the way they are now. But technology alone cannot explain everything. Human behavior also played a role. When a teenager disappeared, people had to decide what the disappearance meant. Was the young person staying with a friend? Had he left voluntarily? Was he avoiding home? Had something unexpected happened? The answer was not always immediately obvious. And when another teenager disappeared somewhere else, the second case could appear unrelated. The result was a dangerous fragmentation of information. Each family possessed part of the story. Each missing person report represented another piece. But no one yet had the complete picture. Coral's death changed that. Suddenly, investigators had information that could connect previously separate events. The locations associated with Coral provided physical evidence. Henley's statements provided information. The missing person records provided names. Together, those elements began forming a coherent picture. And that picture was horrifying. The investigation was no longer asking whether Coral had committed one killing. It was asking how many lives had been lost. The answer would become one of the most disturbing figures in Houston's criminal history. Yet, even as investigators began understanding the scale, another issue became impossible to ignore. Henley himself was not simply an outside witness. He had participated in the world surrounding Coral. That meant investigators were not listening to the account of a completely uninvolved observer. They were hearing information from someone whose own actions would have to be examined. This made the case more complicated, not less. Henley's actions on August 8th had exposed the crimes, but they did not erase his involvement. The investigation therefore moved in 2 directions at once. Investigators had to uncover the crimes associated with Coral. At the same time, they had to determine the roles played by the people who had been close to him. David Owen Brooks would become central to that process. Henley would as well. The eventual legal consequences would fall not on Coral, who was already dead, but on those who survived him. For the families of the victims, however, the legal questions were secondary to something much more immediate. They wanted to know what had happened to their children. And for some families, the investigation finally gave them that answer. For others, the answer remained incomplete. That uncertainty would survive beyond the original investigation and into later decades. The discoveries of 1973 therefore created two timelines. One belonged to the police investigation, which moved rapidly after Coral's death. The other belonged to the families, whose search for answers had sometimes already lasted years and, in some cases, would continue for decades. The contrast was profound. For investigators, August 1973 was the beginning of an extraordinary discovery. For families who had been waiting since the early years of the decade, it was the moment when hope could be replaced by certainty. And certainty, in this case, was devastating. The man at the center of the crimes was dead, but the investigation was alive. The names of missing young people were being compared against newly discovered evidence. Locations were being examined. Relationships were being reconstructed. And the number of victims was becoming clearer. What had been hidden for years was finally being brought into the open. Yet the most difficult work was still ahead. Investigators would have to establish what could be proved, identify the victims, understand the roles of Brooks and Henley, and determine what legal consequences could follow. Coral could not be brought before a court. The truth about him would have to be established through evidence and testimony. And the people who remained alive would have to answer for their own actions. The secret had been broken. Now came the question of what justice could possibly look like after so many lives had already been lost. After Dean Coral's death, investigators were no longer dealing with a conventional homicide. The evidence emerging from the investigation suggested that the killing in Pasadena was only the visible surface of something much larger. The information provided by Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. gave investigators a direction. Locations connected to Coral could now be examined. The names of missing young people could be compared with what investigators were discovering. And slowly, the separate disappearances that had once seemed unrelated began to converge. This was the beginning of the reconstruction. The task was enormous because the suspected killings had taken place over several years. There was no single crime scene containing every answer. Instead, investigators had to work across different locations and different periods of time. One important location was a boat shed area in Houston. Other locations were in southeastern Texas, including an area near Lake Sam Rayburn. These places became important because information connected to Coral led investigators toward evidence of victims who had been buried there. The discoveries transformed the investigation. Every set of remains raised the same fundamental question: who is this person? That question was particularly difficult in an era before modern DNA databases could rapidly compare unidentified remains with missing person records. Investigators had to rely on the evidence available to them at the time, including existing records and information provided by families. The work was not simply about counting victims. It was about restoring identities. A person who had disappeared could not remain merely a name on a missing person list if investigators could establish what had happened. The process of identification gave families the possibility of an answer, even when that answer was devastating. The investigation therefore moved between two worlds. There was the physical evidence recovered from the locations, and there were the human stories contained in missing person reports. Somewhere behind every report was a family that had once expected a young person to return. Now investigators had to determine whether that young person was among the victims connected to Coral. As the investigation developed, the number of victims associated with the case increased. The figure commonly cited is at least 28, while some accounts use 29 depending on how unidentified cases and remains are counted. But the investigation did not become simpler as the number increased. In some ways, it became more complicated. A larger number of victims meant more identities to establish, more disappearances to compare, and more families to contact. The investigators were effectively working backward through years of uncertainty. A disappearance from one year had to be considered alongside another disappearance from a later year. A name might appear in an old missing person report. Another could emerge from information surrounding Coral. A third might remain unidentified until much later. The process demanded patience. It also revealed the limits of the investigative systems available at the time. Today, Investigators can search digital databases, compare DNA profiles, examine extensive electronic records, and rapidly distribute information across agencies. In the early 1970s, those capabilities did not exist in their modern form. This does not mean that investigators simply ignored the disappearances. Rather, it helps explain why individual cases could remain separated from one another. The absence of modern technology created gaps between pieces of information. A missing teenager in one part of Houston might have no obvious connection to another missing teenager elsewhere. Without a known suspect or a common location, investigators had little reason to assume that the cases belonged to the same pattern. The situation became even more complicated because many of the missing were young. A teenager who did not return home could be viewed through many possible explanations. The circumstances did not automatically reveal that a violent crime had occurred. That uncertainty could delay recognition of a larger pattern. The Coral investigation demonstrated the danger of that fragmentation. Once investigators had information linking the missing young people to Coral, the individual cases took on a different meaning. The disappearance was no longer an isolated event. It could be part of a sequence. The role of David Owen Brooks became especially significant during this reconstruction. Brooks had known Coral and had become involved in helping him gain access to younger people. His relationship with Coral was therefore not simply that of an acquaintance who discovered the truth after the fact. He was part of the network surrounding Coral. That fact meant investigators had to examine his knowledge and actions carefully. What had Brooks known? When had he known it? What had he done? And how did his relationship with Coral connect to the missing young people? These were questions that could not be answered simply by looking at the locations where remains were discovered. They required an understanding of relationships. Henley's role presented a similar challenge. He had provided information after killing Coral, and that information became critical to exposing the larger case. But Henley was not an uninvolved witness. He had participated in activities connected to Coral. That meant his statements had to be considered within the context of his own involvement. The fact that he had helped expose the crimes did not erase the actions that had brought him into Coral's world. This distinction would become crucial when the investigation moved toward prosecution. Before that could happen, however, investigators had to establish the identities of the victims. For the families, this was the most important part of the investigation. Some had already spent years wondering what had happened. They had no grave to visit and no confirmed explanation for their child's absence. The discovery of remains could change that. But identification could also take time. Stephen Sickman's case demonstrates the extraordinary length of that process. Sickman disappeared in 1972. His remains were eventually identified through DNA testing in 2011. That later identification shows how forensic science could continue the work begun in 1973. The original investigation had uncovered the remains, but decades later, improved technology could help establish an identity that had remained uncertain. The passage of time did not make the disappearance less important. It made the unanswered question more persistent. And Sickman's identification was not an isolated reminder that the investigation had unfinished elements. There were still unidentified remains and questions surrounding people who might have been connected to the case. The possibility that not every victim had been conclusively identified meant that the story could not be treated as completely closed. The investigation also forced Houston to confront a broader question. How could so many young people disappear without the connection becoming obvious earlier? There was no single explanation. The crimes unfolded over a period of years. The disappearances were separated in time. The victims came from different circumstances. Information was divided among families, friends, and investigators. And the people closest to Coral did not immediately bring the entire truth to authorities. That last point is especially difficult. The presence of Brooks and Henley meant that Coral had access to information and relationships that could help him remain hidden. Their involvement also demonstrated how complicated human relationships can become when fear, influence, secrecy, and loyalty intersect. But it is important not to turn that complexity into an excuse. The victims were the people who lost everything. The adults and teenagers surrounding Coral made choices, and those choices had consequences. The investigation would eventually have to distinguish between different levels of involvement and determine responsibility through the courts. Coral himself would never face that process. He was already dead. That left prosecutors with a difficult legal landscape. The central offender in the investigation could not be tried. The people who remained alive, however, could. And that meant the evidence collected after August 8th would become crucial. Investigators had to establish what had happened and how the surviving participants were connected to it. The discoveries also provided a historical record that would outlast the people directly involved. The names of victims could be restored. Families could finally receive answers. And the case could become a warning about the consequences of treating disappearances as isolated events. The most haunting part of the reconstruction was therefore not simply the number of victims. It was the realization that each disappearance had been a warning that existed independently until the pieces were finally assembled. One missing young person, then another, then another. Years later, investigators could see the pattern. But the families had lived through each disappearance without that knowledge. They had experienced the uncertainty one household at a time. The investigation after Coral's death finally brought those separate stories together. And as the evidence accumulated, the focus shifted. The question was no longer only what had happened at the locations connected to Coral. The question became who should be held responsible. Coral could not answer. The victims could not speak for themselves. So investigators and prosecutors would have to rely on the surviving evidence and the statements of those who had been closest to the events. That would bring the case into the courtroom. For the first time, the investigation would move from discovering what had happened to determining what could legally be proven. And that transition would expose another difficult truth. Even after the hidden world surrounding Dean Coral had been uncovered, justice would not be simple. The man whose name had become synonymous with the crimes was dead. The victims were gone. And the people who remained would have to answer for their own roles in a case that had already changed Houston forever. By the time the investigation moved toward the courtroom, the central figure in the case was already dead. Dean Coral would never be prosecuted. He would never sit before a judge. He would never hear prosecutors describe the evidence against him or listen as the names of his victims were presented in court. The man at the center of the investigation had died on August 8, 1973, when Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. shot him during a confrontation in Pasadena. That left investigators and prosecutors with a difficult task. They had to establish responsibility without being able to put Coral on trial. The surviving participants became central to that process. David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. had both been connected to Coral, but their roles were not identical. Their relationships with him, their knowledge of his activities, and their actions surrounding the victims had to be examined separately. The fact that Henley had killed Coral did not make him an innocent witness. His actions before the confrontation had to be considered as part of the larger investigation. This distinction became essential. The discovery of the killings had begun with Henley's actions, but the legal consequences did not end there. The information he provided helped investigators uncover the scale of Coral's crimes, while his own participation placed him within the investigation as a defendant rather than simply an observer. For prosecutors, the question was no longer only what had happened. It was what could be established in court. The investigation had uncovered remains and connected them to a series of missing young people. It had revealed relationships among Coral, Brooks, and Henley. It had shown that the crimes had continued over a period of years. But a courtroom required specific evidence. Each defendant's actions had to be considered through the legal system. Coral's death meant that one part of the story would never receive a courtroom verdict. There would be no trial that could formally determine his guilt. Instead, the evidence uncovered after his death became the historical and investigative record through which his crimes were understood. For the victims' families, however, the absence of Coral from the courtroom could not have been easy to separate from the discoveries being made around them. They had already endured the disappearance of their children. Now they were learning that those disappearances were connected to something far more terrible than they had imagined. The investigation had provided answers, but those answers came with a cost. Some families could finally stop wondering whether their missing child might still return. Others were left with incomplete information because not every identity could immediately be established. The legal proceedings involving Brooks and Henley therefore took place against the background of a much larger tragedy. The courtroom could determine responsibility for particular crimes. It could not restore the victims. It could not return the years families had spent waiting. And it could not erase the fact that Quarles had operated for years before the full scale of the crimes became known. Henley's position was especially complicated. He had been a teenager when he became involved with Quarles. He was also the person whose confrontation with Quarles ultimately exposed the hidden crimes. But those two facts could not simply be placed on opposite sides of a moral scale and treated as if one erased the other. Henley had participated in the activities surrounding Quarles. He had knowledge of what was happening. His role was therefore examined as part of the criminal investigation. The later legal consequences reflected that involvement. Henley was convicted in connection with multiple killings and received multiple life sentences. Brooks was also prosecuted for his participation and was convicted in connection with the crimes. The courtroom proceedings therefore produced an important distinction between the man who had died and the people who remained. Quarles could not be punished by the legal system because he was already dead. Brooks and Henley could. Their cases became the means through which the justice system addressed the actions of surviving participants. But even with convictions, the case remained emotionally unfinished. There was no sentence capable of balancing the scale against the number of lives lost. There was no verdict that could restore a son to his parents. There was no punishment that could erase the years of uncertainty. The legal system could establish responsibility. It could not undo the consequences. That difference is important when examining notorious criminal cases. The conclusion of a trial does not necessarily mean the conclusion of grief. For many families connected to the Quarles case, the investigation and court proceedings represented only one stage in a much longer process. Some identities remained unresolved. Some remains required later forensic work. And some questions about the full extent of Quarles' activities continued after the original investigation. Stephen Sickman's case demonstrates this continuing process. Sickman disappeared in 1972 during the period associated with Quarles' crimes. His remains were eventually identified through DNA testing in 2011. The identification came decades after the original investigation. It showed that the work of identifying victims could continue long after the courtroom proceedings had ended. Modern forensic science could revisit evidence that investigators in the 1970s had been unable to resolve completely. For families, an identification after decades could carry an extraordinary mixture of emotions. There could be grief because the possibility of a different outcome had finally disappeared. There could also be relief because uncertainty had finally ended. The person was no longer simply missing. A name could finally be connected to remains. A family could finally know what had happened. Yet the existence of later identifications also revealed something else. The Quarles investigation was never as simple as a case that began and ended in August 1973. The discovery of the crimes was immediate. The consequences were not. Even after Quarles' death, Brooks's conviction, and Henley's convictions and sentences, investigators and forensic specialists continued to confront questions about identities and possible victims. The commonly cited number of victims is at least 28, while some accounts refer to 29 depending on how unidentified cases and remains are counted. That difference itself illustrates the difficulty of defining the final boundaries of the case. When a victim remains unidentified, the investigation has not achieved the same kind of closure as when a name, identity, and missing person report can be connected. And behind every unidentified victim is the possibility that somewhere, someone once waited for that person to come home. This is why the legal ending of the Quarles case cannot be separated from its human consequences. The courtroom dealt with defendants. The investigation dealt with evidence. But families dealt with absence. For them, the most important question was often much simpler than the questions being asked by prosecutors. What happened to my child? The discoveries following Quarles' death provided answers for many. They also revealed how long some families had been living without them. That is perhaps the most painful contradiction of the case. The investigation eventually produced extraordinary amounts of information. But that information arrived only after the victims were gone. The truth became visible only after years of disappearances. The courtroom could then establish responsibility for the surviving participants, but it could not change the past. The case also left Houston with a difficult question about recognition. Could these disappearances have been connected earlier? Could a pattern have been seen before the discovery of the remains? There is no simple answer. The crimes occurred during a different era, under investigative conditions very different from those of today. Missing person information was not connected through modern digital systems. Communication was slower. Forensic technology was more limited. And individual disappearances could appear unrelated. But the case remains a reminder of the danger created when separate pieces of information remain isolated. One family knows that a child is missing. Another family knows the same thing. A third family is waiting. Yet without a connection, the separate cases may not immediately become one investigation. That connection finally emerged after Coral's death. And by then, the scale of the tragedy was enormous. The legal system could prosecute the surviving participants. It could impose life sentences. It could establish responsibility for the crimes that could be proved. But no court could prosecute the years themselves. No sentence could restore the victims' futures. No verdict could return the families to the moment before their children disappeared. The case therefore reached a legal conclusion without reaching a complete human conclusion. And perhaps that is why the Dean Coral case continues to be remembered. Not simply because of the man at its center. Not simply because of the number of victims. And not simply because of the shocking discovery that followed his death. It remains because the case exposes the distance between discovering a crime and understanding its consequences. Coral was dead. The hidden locations had been found. The victims were being identified. The surviving participants had been convicted and sentenced. But for the families, the story did not end in a courtroom. It continued in the years afterward, through memories, unanswered questions, later forensic identifications, and the continuing effort to make sure that the young people who disappeared would not be remembered merely as numbers. Their names were the real evidence of what had been lost. And their stories were the reason the investigation mattered. The case had begun with disappearances. It had exploded into a murder investigation. It had moved into the courtroom. But its final consequences would be measured not by the sentences imposed on the surviving offenders, but by the families who were left to live with what the investigation had finally revealed. The discovery of Dean Coral's crimes changed the meaning of every disappearance connected to his name. Before 1973, a missing teenager could remain a question. After the investigation began, some of those questions became answers. But the answers were devastating. For the families of the victims, the end of uncertainty did not mean the end of suffering. In many cases, it meant confronting a reality that was far more painful than the possibility that their child might still return. This is one of the hardest parts of the Coral case to understand from a distance. History often remembers the investigation through its numbers. 28 victims. 29, depending on how certain cases and unidentified remains are counted. 3 central figures. Several locations. A period of roughly 3 years. But families did not experience the case through numbers. They experienced it through absence. A missing young person leaves behind a space that can dominate an entire household. A family may continue looking for explanations because there is no confirmed ending. The possibility of a return, however small, can remain present. Then the investigation into Coral began to connect some of those disappearances with the remains discovered at locations associated with him. The meaning of the missing person reports changed. A report that had once represented uncertainty could now represent a victim. For some families, investigators could finally establish what had happened. For others, the process was slower. This difference became especially important because not every victim could immediately be identified. The discovery of remains did not automatically provide a name. Investigators had to work with the information and technology available to them. The passage of time created another obstacle. Years could separate a disappearance from the moment investigators discovered evidence connected to it. Memories changed. Records could be incomplete. And forensic technology in the early 1970s was nowhere near the level available decades later. The story of Stephen Sickman demonstrates how long this process could continue. Sickman disappeared in 1972. At the time, his disappearance was one more unresolved absence in a city where investigators did not yet understand the larger patterns surrounding Dean Corll. His remains were eventually identified through DNA testing in 2011. The date alone tells a powerful story. 1972 was the year of his disappearance. 2011 was the year science finally provided confirmation of his identity. Almost 4 decades separated those moments. For the family, the identification could not change what had happened, but it could finally replace uncertainty with knowledge. That distinction matters. A family living with a missing person does not know whether to grieve completely or continue hoping. There is no definitive answer to guide them. Identification removes that uncertainty. It can be painful precisely because it is final, but it can also restore something that disappearance has taken away, a person's identity. Stephen Sickman was no longer simply someone who had disappeared. His name could once again be connected to the story. That same principle applies to every victim whose identity was established. The investigation was not merely counting bodies. It was recovering names. And every recovered name represented a life that had existed before the crime. The victims associated with the Corll case were young. They had families and friends. They had ordinary futures that had once seemed to stretch ahead of them. Their lives cannot be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. This is particularly important when discussing notorious crimes because the person responsible can easily become the center of the story. Dean Corll's name became famous. His nickname became part of criminal history. The phrase Candyman Killer became associated with the case. But the victims were the people who lost the most. They did not choose to become part of a notorious investigation. They did not know that their names would later appear in accounts of one of Houston's most disturbing criminal cases. Their families did not ask to become part of that history either. They simply wanted their children home. The discovery of Corll's crimes therefore created a painful transformation. Families who had spent years asking where their children were suddenly had to confront information about how they had died. Some families received answers relatively close to the original investigation. Others had to wait much longer. And some questions remained. The existence of unidentified remains meant that investigators could not assume every part of the story had been resolved. Even decades later, efforts continued to establish the identities of people whose remains had been associated with the broader investigation. That fact gives the case a different kind of ending. There is no single moment when every question disappears. Instead, there is a continuing process of identification and remembrance. Modern forensic science became part of that process. DNA technology eventually helped investigators establish identities that had remained uncertain in the 1970s. In cases like Sickman's, science provided an answer that earlier investigators simply could not obtain. This also demonstrates why old cases can change over time. Evidence does not necessarily become meaningless simply because decades have passed. New technology can sometimes allow investigators to examine old evidence in ways that were previously impossible. But science cannot recover everything. There are questions that remain dependent on information that may never be found. There are memories that may have disappeared with the people who possess them. There are details that cannot be reconstructed with certainty. And there are families who may never receive every answer they wanted. That uncertainty is part of the legacy of the Corll case. Another important part of that legacy is the question of recognition. Why did the disappearances not immediately become one connected investigation? There is no single explanation that can fully answer it. The crimes unfolded over several years. The victims disappeared at different times. Different families reported different disappearances. The investigative technology of the period was limited compared with what exists today. There were no smartphones constantly connecting people. There was no widespread digital surveillance network. There was no modern DNA database capable of rapidly comparing unidentified remains against large collections of missing person profiles. But technology was only one part of the problem. Human perception mattered too. A disappearance can be difficult to interpret when the larger context is unknown. A teenager who does not come home might have left voluntarily. A young person might be staying with someone else. A family might believe the person will return. Investigators might not initially have enough information to conclude that a violent crime has occurred. When another young person disappears later, the connection may still not be obvious. This is how patterns can remain hidden. Each event exists separately until someone has enough information to place them together. The Coral investigation finally provided that missing connection. Once investigators knew that Coral was associated with multiple victims, the earlier disappearances could be examined differently. The names on missing person records were no longer isolated. They became potential pieces of the same investigation. This retrospective understanding was powerful, but it was also painful. It meant that some disappearances that had once seemed mysterious now had a terrible explanation. The discovery of the truth could therefore bring two emotions at once: relief and grief. Relief, because the family finally knew. Grief, because the answer was worse than they had hoped. That contradiction is difficult to express. A family can spend years asking for an answer while simultaneously fearing what that answer might be. When the answer finally arrives, there is no simple emotional response. There is only reality. The Coral case also left a lasting reminder about unidentified victims. A person without a confirmed identity can become almost invisible within a historical record. Investigators may know that someone died. They may know where remains were found. They may know that the person was connected to a particular case. But without a name, the story remains incomplete. That is why later identification matters so much. It restores individuality. It tells the world that this was not simply an unidentified victim. This was a particular person who had a particular life. And somewhere, people once knew that person by name. The work of identification, therefore, became part of the broader legacy of the case. The investigation did not simply expose Dean Coral. It also brought attention to the young people who had disappeared and to the families who had spent years searching for them. That distinction should remain at the center of the story. Coral's crimes were shocking. The number of victims was extraordinary. The discovery of the remains was one of the most disturbing investigative developments in Houston's history. But the deepest tragedy was more ordinary. Young people went missing. Families waited. And for too long, the connections between those disappearances remained unclear. The investigation eventually changed that. It gave many families answers. It also revealed how much had been lost. Yet the case was still not finished. The courtroom had addressed the surviving participants. Forensic science would continue identifying victims. But another question remained. What did the Coral case reveal about the way a community recognizes danger? How could a pattern involving so many young people remain hidden for years? And what could be learned from the failure to see those separate disappearances as one story? Those questions would become part of the broader legacy of the Houston mass murders. Because the most disturbing lesson was not simply that one man could commit terrible crimes. It was that a pattern can exist for years without becoming visible. Sometimes the clues are present. Sometimes the warnings exist. But until the pieces are connected, they remain fragments. The Coral investigation finally connected them. And when the pieces came together, Houston was forced to confront a reality that had been developing quietly for years. The young people who had vanished were not isolated cases. They belonged to one of the darkest chapters in the city's criminal history. And behind every number was someone who had once been expected to come home. After the discovery of Dean Coral's crimes, attention naturally turned toward the people who had survived him. Coral himself was dead. The victims were gone. But two young men remained at the center of the investigation, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. Their presence complicated the story because neither could be described simply as an uninvolved witness. Both had been connected to Coral, and both had played roles in the network surrounding him. Their actions had to be examined alongside the evidence recovered after Coral's death. For investigators, this created a difficult task. The death of Coral had exposed the crimes, but it had not answered every question. His death meant that the central figure could no longer provide testimony, explain his actions, or respond to accusations. Investigators, therefore, had to reconstruct the case through surviving evidence and the accounts of those who had known him. Henley became particularly important because his confrontation with Coral had brought the hidden world into view. On August 8, 1973, Henley shot Coral during their confrontation in Pasadena. That action ended Coral's life. But it did not erase Henley's own involvement. This distinction became essential. It is tempting to look at the events of that day as a simple story in which one young man stopped a dangerous killer. But the evidence surrounding the broader case was more complicated. Henley had become involved with Coral before the final confrontation. He knew about Coral's activities and had participated in the network surrounding him. The fact that Henley ultimately exposed the crimes did not make his previous actions disappear. The investigation, therefore, had to examine two different realities at once. One was the information Henley provided after Coral's death. The other was Henley's own role in the events being investigated. Those realities could exist together. Henley could provide information that helped investigators discover the scale of the crimes while also facing legal consequences for his own participation. That complexity is one of the defining features of the case. David Owen Brooks presented another important part of the same problem. Brooks had known Coral and had become involved in helping him gain access to younger people. His connection to Coral was not merely accidental. Investigators had to determine what Brooks knew, what he had done, and how his actions related to the young people who disappeared. The investigation therefore moved beyond the question of Coral himself. It became an examination of a network. The existence of that network helped explain how Coral could maintain access to young people over an extended period. It also demonstrated that the crimes did not occur in complete isolation. There were relationships around Coral. There were people who interacted with him. There were people who knew parts of his hidden life. And there were young people who became victims. The legal system would eventually have to separate these different roles. That process was especially important because Coral could never be prosecuted. He was already dead. There would be no trial in which a jury could formally determine his guilt. His actions would instead be reconstructed through the investigation and through the evidence connected to the victims. For the surviving participants, however, the situation was different. They could be prosecuted. They could be brought before the courts. And they could be held legally responsible for their own actions. Henley was convicted in connection with multiple killings and received multiple life sentences. Brooks was also prosecuted and convicted for his involvement. Their convictions established an important legal distinction. The case was not simply about what Dean Coral had done. It was also about what the people around him had done. That distinction matters because notorious crimes can sometimes become so closely associated with one central offender that everyone else disappears from the narrative. In the Coral case, that would be misleading. The surviving participants were part of the story. Their decisions mattered. Their knowledge mattered. And their actions mattered. At the same time, it is important not to allow the surviving offenders to overshadow the victims. The legal proceedings were about responsibility. The investigation was about evidence. But the tragedy was about the young people who had disappeared. The people whose families had waited. The people whose identities had to be reconstructed. The people whose lives had ended before they could grow into the futures their families had imagined. This distinction becomes particularly important when examining Henley. His role was deeply contradictory. He helped expose the crimes. He also participated in the circumstances surrounding them. Both facts are part of the historical record. Neither can simply be removed because it makes the story more comparable. The same complexity applies to Brooks. His involvement meant that the investigation had to consider how Coral gained access to some victims and how relationships within the group contributed to the crimes remaining hidden. But the existence of accomplices did not reduce Coral's responsibility, nor did it reduce the responsibility of those who knowingly participated. Instead, it showed that the case involved a complicated structure of relationships rather than a completely isolated offender. That structure also helps explain why the investigation was so difficult to understand after Coral's death. Investigators were not simply examining one man's actions. They were reconstructing interactions between several people across several years. The evidence had to be connected to individual victims. The locations had to be examined. The missing person records had to be compared. And the statements of surviving participants had to be considered alongside everything else. This process transformed the case from a mystery surrounding one dead man into a broader examination of responsibility. It also raised uncomfortable questions about silence. If people around Coral knew something was wrong, why did the authorities not learn the full truth sooner? The answer cannot be reduced to one sentence. Some information may have been incomplete. Some people may not have understood the full scale of what was happening. The technology of the period made connections more difficult. And the young people involved were operating within relationships whose full nature was not immediately visible to outsiders. But whatever the reasons, the result was the same. The crimes continued. Young people disappeared. Families waited. And the pattern remained hidden until the confrontation that ended Coral's life. That is why August 8, 1973, occupies such a critical place in the history of the case. Before that date, Coral's activities remained largely hidden. After that date, investigators began discovering the evidence that revealed their scale. The difference was not simply the death of one man. It was the collapse of secrecy. Once the investigators had information connecting Coral to burial locations and missing young people, the previous years could be viewed differently. Old disappearances became potential evidence. Old relationships became relevant. Names that had once existed separately could now be placed beside one another. And the surviving participants became sources of information as well as subjects of prosecution. The legal system could not undo the crimes, but it could establish consequences for those who remained alive. Hemley's life would be permanently defined by his involvement in the case. Brooks's would be as well. Their convictions ensured that the surviving participants would not simply disappear from the story after Coral's death. Yet justice had limits. No sentence could return the victims. No courtroom could restore the family's lost years. No verdict could erase the empty rooms left behind. And no legal conclusion could guarantee that every question surrounding the case had been answered. That final point is particularly important. The investigation established a large number of victims, but the exact boundaries of the case remained complicated. The commonly cited figure is at least 28 victims, while some accounts use 29 depending on the treatment of unidentified cases and remains. Some victims were identified only much later. Some remains remained difficult to connect conclusively to names. And the possibility of unresolved identities meant that the story could continue beyond the original prosecution. This is why the Coral case should not be understood as a story with one clean ending. There was the day Coral died. There were the discoveries that followed. There were the prosecutions and convictions. There were later forensic identifications. And there were families who continued carrying the consequences. Each stage answered some questions while leaving others. For the people who had lost someone, the most important question was never how famous the case became. It was simply whether their missing loved one had been found. That is where the surviving human dimension of the case remained strongest. The victims were young people whose lives had been interrupted. The families were people who had waited. The investigators were trying to reconstruct events after the central offender was already dead. And the surviving participants were forced to face the consequences of their own actions. The story therefore moved in different directions after August 1973. The criminal investigation sought facts. The courts sought responsibility. Forensic science sought identities. Families sought closure. And history sought to understand how such a large pattern could remain hidden for so long. There is no single answer that satisfies all of those questions. But one fact remains clear. The death of Dean Coral did not end the story. It opened it. And what investigators found after that moment would permanently change the way the disappearances of young people in Houston were understood. The secret had survived for years. Once it was exposed, it could not be hidden again. But exposing the truth did not mean that the damage could be repaired. The people who had disappeared would not return. The families who had waited could not recover the years they had lost. And the survivors of the investigation would have to live with what they knew. That was the legacy left behind after Coral was gone. Not simply a criminal case, Not simply a collection of convictions, but a record of lives lost, families devastated, and unanswered questions that continued long after the courtroom doors had closed. By the time the surviving participants had faced the legal consequences of their involvement, the investigation into Dean Corll had already changed the understanding of what had happened in Houston. The immediate mystery had been solved in one sense. Corll was dead. The locations connected to him had been investigated. Human remains had been discovered. Missing young people had been connected to the case. David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. had been prosecuted and convicted for their roles. But solving a crime does not necessarily mean answering every question. The Corll case left behind questions that could not be resolved simply by a conviction or a sentence. One of the most important concerned the true number of victims. The figure most commonly associated with the case is at least 28 victims. Some accounts refer to 29, depending on how unidentified cases and remains are counted. That difference may appear small, but in a case involving unidentified remains, every number represents a person. If one victim remains unidentified, then one family may still be without an answer. If the boundaries of the case remain uncertain, then investigators and forensic specialists must continue examining what is known and what is not. This is why the investigation did not completely disappear into history after the original prosecutions. The evidence continued to matter. The identities continued to matter. And the families continued to matter. The passage of time also changed what investigators were capable of doing. In the early 1970s, forensic science was far more limited than it would become in later decades. Investigators had to work with the tools available to them. When remains could not be conclusively identified, the case could remain unresolved. Decades later, DNA technology created new possibilities. The case of Stephen Sickman is an important example. Sickman disappeared in 1972. His disappearance occurred during the period associated with Corll's crimes, but his identity was not confirmed through DNA until 2011. That means his case remained unresolved for almost 4 decades. The importance of that identification goes beyond one name. It demonstrates that a case can continue to develop long after the original investigation has ended. Technology can change. Evidence can be reconsidered. And an unidentified person can eventually be restored to the historical record by name. For families, such an identification can bring an end to one form of uncertainty. But it can also reopen grief that had been carried for years. The disappearance of a loved one creates a strange kind of waiting. Without confirmation, a family may continue imagining possibilities. There may be hope. There may be fear. There may be uncertainty about whether the person left voluntarily, whether something happened, or whether the person might eventually return. When forensic evidence finally provides an identity, the uncertainty disappears. But the answer may be devastating. The family is no longer waiting for someone who might come home. They now know that the person is gone. This is one of the reasons identification should be understood as more than a technical achievement. It is a human event. A name is restored. A family history becomes clearer. A missing person becomes a known victim. And a story that had remained unfinished receives another piece of its ending. Yet the Corll investigation contained other unanswered questions. One concerned the possibility that not every person connected to the crimes had been identified. The existence of unidentified remains meant investigators could not assume that every victim had been given a name. Later efforts continued to examine evidence and locations associated with the case. The possibility of additional victims remained part of the broader questions surrounding Corll. This uncertainty is one reason the case remains important decades after the original discoveries. It is not simply a historical account with every fact neatly arranged. There are known facts. There are identified victims. There are convictions. There are locations connected to the investigation. But there are also gaps. Those gaps are uncomfortable because they represent the limits of what investigators were able to establish. They also remind us that criminal investigations are built from evidence. Where evidence exists, conclusions can be reached. Where evidence is missing, investigators must be careful not to turn uncertainty into certainty. That distinction is particularly important in a case as notorious as this one. The scale of the crimes can create a temptation to assume that every disappearance from the same period must have been connected to Coral. But the available evidence does not justify treating every unexplained disappearance as part of his crimes. The responsible approach is to distinguish between what investigators established and what remains uncertain. What is established is already horrifying. Coral was connected to a large number of killings involving young victims. Brooks and Henley played significant roles in the network surrounding him. The investigation after Coral's death uncovered remains at several locations. Many victims were identified, and surviving participants were prosecuted. Those facts alone explain why the case became one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Houston's history. The unanswered questions do not make the established facts less significant. They simply show that the investigation had limits. Another unresolved question concerns the failure to recognize the larger pattern earlier. How could young people disappear over several years without the connection becoming immediately obvious? Again, there is no single explanation. The disappearances occurred over time. They were not one event. Different families experienced different circumstances. The city was large and changing, and investigative technology was very different from what exists today. There were no smartphones. There was no modern location sharing technology. There was no extensive digital surveillance network. There was no modern DNA database capable of rapidly comparing unidentified remains with missing person records. Information could remain separated. A missing person report could exist in one place while information about another disappearance remained elsewhere. Without a known connection, there was no automatic mechanism forcing those pieces together. But technology alone does not explain everything. The human element matters. People interpret events according to what they know. A teenager who fails to come home may initially be considered missing without anyone knowing whether the absence is voluntary or the result of something more serious. When another young person disappears months later, the second disappearance may not immediately seem connected to the first. The pattern only becomes visible when enough information accumulates. That is precisely what happened after Coral's death. Henley's information gave investigators a direction. The locations provided evidence. The missing person records provided names. The investigation connected the pieces. Suddenly, events that had existed separately could be understood as part of a much larger story. But that retrospective clarity can be misleading. Once we know the ending, the earlier events can appear obvious. They were not necessarily obvious at the time. That is an important lesson from the case. A pattern can be clear in retrospect while remaining almost invisible while it is developing. For the families, there was no retrospective perspective. They experienced only their own disappearance, their own unanswered phone calls, their own empty spaces, their own uncertainty. They did not know that another family elsewhere might be living through the same experience. The eventual investigation connected those families through tragedy, but it could not give them back the years that had already passed. The legal consequences also had limits. Henley and Brooks were convicted and sentenced. The justice system had established responsibility for the surviving participants. But Coral himself was beyond prosecution. His death meant that no courtroom could formally impose a sentence upon him. This creates another unusual feature of the case. The person whose name became most strongly associated with the murders never faced the justice system. The historical judgment against him came from the evidence uncovered after his death. The surviving defendants faced the courts. Coral did not. For the families, that distinction may have mattered less than the truth itself. They had lost their children. They needed to know what had happened. They needed names to be connected to remains. They needed answers where answers were possible. And in some cases, those answers took decades. The passage of time, therefore, became part of the case's legacy. The original investigation belonged to the early 1970s. Later identifications belonged to a different era. New forensic methods could revisit old evidence. People who had once been missing could finally be identified. But even modern science could not guarantee that every question would be resolved. Some mysteries remain mysteries because the evidence is incomplete. The responsible way to remember the Coral case is therefore not to fill those gaps with speculation. It is to acknowledge them. There are victims whose identities were established. There are cases where identification required decades. There are unidentified remains and questions that have remained part of the broader investigation. And there are families whose experiences cannot be fully reconstructed from surviving records. That uncertainty does not diminish their importance. It makes remembrance more important, because behind every unresolved identity is the possibility of a person who once had a family waiting for them. The Coral case also demonstrates why the victims should remain at the center of the story. The name Dean Coral is now famous because of the crimes. The name Elmer Wayne Henley is remembered because of both his involvement and the confrontation that exposed the crimes. David Owen Brooks is remembered because of his role in the network surrounding Coral. But the young people who disappeared should not become secondary characters in their own story. They were the reason the investigation mattered. They were the reason families waited. They were the reason investigators searched. And they were the reason later forensic identifications carried such importance. The most meaningful legacy of the case is therefore not simply the notoriety of the offender. It is the restoration of the victims' identities and the recognition of the families who spent years searching for answers. The Coral case began with disappearances that seemed separate. It became a major investigation after Coral's death. It produced convictions for surviving participants. It continued through forensic identification. And it left behind questions that could not all be answered. That is not an unusual feature of old criminal cases. But in this case, the scale makes the uncertainty especially difficult. At least 28 victims are associated with the investigation. Some accounts use 29. One victim, Stephen Sickman, was not identified until 2011. And even after decades of investigation, the broader story contains unresolved elements. The final lesson is therefore not that every mystery has an answer. Sometimes the truth is partial. Sometimes evidence can answer one question while leaving another unanswered. Sometimes a family waits years for an identification. And sometimes the only responsible conclusion is to acknowledge what is known without pretending to know what is not. That is particularly important when remembering the young people whose lives were taken. Their stories deserve accuracy. Their identities deserve respect. And their families deserve to be remembered alongside the investigation that finally revealed what had happened. Because when the secret surrounding Dean Coral was exposed, the greatest discovery was not simply the existence of a killer. It was the realization that behind years of apparently separate disappearances was a collection of individual lives that had been connected by a crime no one fully understood until it was too late. The investigation revealed the pattern. The courts dealt with the surviving participants. Forensic science continued the work of identification. But the families were left with the most difficult task of all. They had to continue living after the answers arrived. After the investigations, convictions, and discoveries surrounding Dean Coral, Houston was left with a difficult task that no courtroom could complete. The city had to look backward. For years, the disappearances of young people had existed as separate tragedies. Families had reported sons missing. Friends had remembered the last time they had seen them. Investigators had worked with the information available at the time. Yet the larger connection had remained hidden until the events of August 1973 brought everything into focus. Once that connection became visible, the past could no longer be viewed in the same way. Old missing person cases had new significance. Names that had once appeared separately could now be examined within the context of the Coral investigation. The city was forced to confront the possibility that a series of disappearances had been connected to one criminal network operating over several years. The number of victims associated with the case was extraordinary. At least 28 victims are commonly identified, while some accounts use the number 29 depending on how unidentified remains and related cases are counted. But the significance of the number was not simply statistical. Every victim represented a separate disappearance. Every disappearance represented a family. And every family had experienced the uncertainty of not knowing where a loved one had gone. That uncertainty is difficult to understand when viewed only through historical records. A missing person report can appear to be a short document, a name, a date, a description, perhaps the last known location. But behind that information is a much larger human story. There is a family trying to remember what the missing person was wearing, a friend trying to remember the last conversation, a parent wondering whether another phone call might come, a household waiting for footsteps that never arrive. When the Coral investigation began connecting those disappearances to the remains discovered at several locations, the meaning of those old reports changed. The families who had once been asking where their children were could finally receive an answer. But the answer was not the one they had hoped for. The discovery of the truth, therefore, created a painful contradiction. The investigation provided closure, in one sense. It also confirmed the worst possible outcome. That distinction is essential when discussing missing person cases. Closure is not happiness. Knowing what happened does not undo what happened. For some families, the end of uncertainty may have provided a form of peace. For others, the knowledge could only deepen grief. And for families whose loved ones remained unidentified, the uncertainty continued. That is why the later forensic work became so important. The case did not stop evolving simply because the original investigation had taken place in the 1970s. Decades later, DNA technology provided investigators with tools that had not been available when the remains were first discovered. Stephen Sickman's identification is one of the clearest examples. Sickman disappeared in 1972. His remains were eventually identified through DNA testing in 2011. The significance of that identification extends beyond the individual case. It demonstrates how time can change an investigation. Evidence that could not be fully interpreted in one era may become more useful in another. A person who remained unidentified for decades can eventually be connected to a name. And once that name is established, the historical record changes. An unidentified victim becomes an identified person. The family can place the person within the story. The disappearance has an answer. The process also demonstrates why investigators must preserve evidence carefully. The original investigators did not have access to every tool available today. They worked within the limits of their time. Later investigators and forensic specialists could build upon that earlier work. The past could be examined again through modern science. That does not mean every mystery can be solved. Some identities remain uncertain. Some evidence may never provide a definitive answer. Some questions may have disappeared with the people who knew them. But every later identification demonstrates that an old case is not necessarily a dead case. The search for answers can continue. This is particularly important in the Coral investigation because the commonly cited number of victims does not represent a perfectly simple final figure. At least 28 victims are generally associated with the case. Some accounts refer to 29. The difference reflects the complications surrounding unidentified remains and the boundaries of cases attributed to Coral. That uncertainty should not be hidden. A responsible account must distinguish established facts from unresolved possibilities. The confirmed history is already disturbing enough. There is no need to add speculation. What is known is that Coral was associated with a large number of killings involving young victims. What is known is that Brooks and Henley were important figures in the network surrounding him. What is known is that information provided after Coral's death led investigators toward locations where remains were found. What is known is that many victims were eventually identified. What is known is that the surviving participants faced the justice system. And what is also known is that some identification work continued decades later. Those facts are enough to explain the lasting impact of the case. The investigation also raised difficult questions about the relationship between missing person cases and public awareness. When a young person disappears, the family experiences the event immediately. The broader community may not. One disappearance can remain local. Another may occur somewhere else. Without a connection, each family can feel as though it is facing an isolated tragedy. The Coral case revealed how dangerous that separation can become. The pattern was visible only after enough information had been assembled. Once investigators had the necessary information, earlier disappearances could be viewed differently. The same names that had once represented unanswered questions could become part of a larger investigation. But this retrospective clarity should not be confused with obviousness. Knowing the ending makes the earlier events appear connected. At the time, that connection was not necessarily apparent. Houston in the early 1970s did not have the investigative infrastructure that exists today. There were no smartphones. There was no constant digital communication. There was no widespread system automatically connecting missing person reports across agencies. There was no modern DNA database capable of rapidly comparing unidentified remains with missing people. These technological differences mattered, but so did the human element. People act on the information they have. Families may not know what to suspect. Friends may not understand what they have witnessed. Investigators may have only fragments of information. And a pattern cannot always be recognized until someone has enough pieces to see it. The tragedy of the Coral case is that the pieces accumulated over time. Young people disappeared. The years passed. And the connection remained hidden until the events of August 1973. After Coral's death, the investigation finally exposed that hidden structure. The city was forced to reconsider what had been happening. But the responsibility of remembering the victims did not belong only to investigators. It also belonged to history. There is a danger in allowing notorious offenders to dominate the stories built around their crimes. The more famous the offender becomes, the easier it is for the victims to disappear from public memory. The Coral case should not be remembered that way. Dean Coral's name explains the investigation. It should not replace the names of the people who were killed. The young victims were not symbols. They were individuals. They had families. They had friends. They had lives that existed before they became part of a criminal case. Their futures were taken from them. That is the central tragedy. The investigation can be studied. The evidence can be examined. The legal proceedings can be discussed. But the reason any of those things matter is because real people were harmed. The later identification of victims through DNA is therefore more than forensic history. It is an act of restoration. A name brings individuality back into a story that could otherwise become dominated by statistics. Stephen Sickman was not simply one of a number. He was Stephen Sickman. His disappearance occurred in 1972. His identity was eventually confirmed in 2011. The decades between those dates tell us something about the persistence of unresolved cases. They also remind us that families can carry unanswered questions for much longer than investigators may expect. The passage of time does not erase the need for answers. Sometimes it makes that need even more important. The Coral investigation, therefore, became more than a story about what happened between 1970 and 1973. It became a story about what happened afterward. Families continued living with the consequences. Forensic specialists continued examining identities. The historical record continued to develop. And the unresolved elements of the case remained reminders that even a major investigation can leave questions behind. The city that had once seen separate disappearances now knew they had formed part of a much larger tragedy. But knowledge could not restore the lives that had been lost. It could only make their absence understood. That may be the most important difference between solving a crime and repairing its consequences. A crime can be investigated. A suspect can be identified. Evidence can be recovered. A defendant can be convicted. But lives cannot be restored. Families cannot reclaim the years spent waiting. And history cannot rewrite what happened. The best it can do is remember accurately. That responsibility becomes especially important in a case where the central offender has become notorious. The temptation is to focus on the shocking details, to focus on the nickname, to focus on the number, to focus on the mystery. But beneath all of those elements is something much simpler. Young people disappeared. Their families waited. The truth eventually emerged. And many years later, investigators were still working to make sure that the people who disappeared were not forgotten. The legacy of the Coral case is therefore not only about crime. It is about memory. It is about the importance of names. It is about the difference between knowing that someone is missing and knowing what happened to them. And it is about the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the truth arrives years after the people who needed it most have already spent a lifetime waiting. In Houston, the discovery of Dean Corll's crimes forced the city to look backward. What it saw was a pattern of disappearances that had once seemed disconnected. What it found were victims whose identities had to be recovered. And what remained afterward was the responsibility to remember them not as numbers, but as young people whose lives mattered long before their names became part of one of the darkest criminal investigations in the city's history. By the time the investigation into Dean Corll had entered history, the facts were already difficult to comprehend. A man who had operated in Houston and surrounding areas had been connected to the deaths of numerous young people. 2 teenagers, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., had played important roles in the network surrounding him. Corll himself was dead, killed by Henley on August 8, 1973, before he could ever face a courtroom. But the lasting importance of the case was not limited to the crimes themselves. It also revealed how difficult it can be to recognize a pattern while that pattern is still developing. From the perspective of the present, the disappearances can appear connected almost immediately. We know the name Dean Corll. We know that numerous young people were eventually linked to him. We know that investigators discovered remains at locations associated with the case. But the families living through those years did not have that information. They experienced each disappearance separately. One young person did not come home. Another disappeared later. Another family began searching. The connection existed, but it was hidden. This difference between hindsight and reality is one of the most important lessons of the case. When investigators know that multiple disappearances are connected, every previous event becomes more significant. A name in an old report can become evidence. A relationship that once appeared ordinary can become important. A location that seemed unremarkable can become part of a major investigation. But before that connection is known, investigators have to work with incomplete information. Houston in the early 1970s was operating without many of the tools that investigators now consider essential. There were no smartphones, no widespread location sharing systems, and no modern digital networks that could instantly connect information from different missing person cases. There was also no modern DNA database capable of rapidly comparing unidentified remains with large numbers of missing individuals. That does not mean the investigators had no evidence. It means the evidence existed in a different environment. Records could remain separate. Information could move slowly. And a family could know something about its own missing child without knowing that another family elsewhere was facing the same situation. This fragmentation helps explain why the Corll crimes could continue for years. It also raises an uncomfortable question. Could the pattern have been recognized earlier? There is no responsible way to answer that with certainty. It is possible to look backward and identify moments that appear significant because we already know the outcome. But historical investigations have to distinguish between what was knowable at the time and what became clear later. The Corll case demonstrates that distinction vividly. Before August 1973, there was no publicly established connection between all of the young people who would eventually be associated with the investigation. After Corll's death, that connection became much clearer. The information provided by Henley directed investigators toward locations associated with Corll. The discoveries there revealed the scale of the crimes. The missing person records then became critical to identifying victims. The investigation essentially reversed the direction of the mystery. Before August 1973, investigators and families were asking where missing young people had gone. After August 1973, investigators were asking which missing young people could be connected to the evidence they had discovered. That change was enormous. The investigation was no longer moving from uncertainty toward a single missing person. It was moving from physical evidence toward identities. Each identification represented another piece of the larger story. The commonly cited number of victims is at least 28, with some accounts using 29 depending on how unidentified cases and remains are counted. Even this figure requires caution. A number can describe the scale of an investigation, but it cannot describe the people themselves. The victims were young people with families and friends. Their lives existed independently of Dean Corll before they became part of his criminal history. They had identities before investigators knew those identities in relation to the case. That is why the later identification of victims mattered so much. Stephen Sickman, who disappeared in 1972, was not identified through DNA until 2011. That single example demonstrates the distance between discovery and understanding. The investigation in 1973 could uncover remains. Decades later, forensic science could provide an identity. The two moments belonged to different eras, but they were connected by the same unanswered question. Who was this person? The answer mattered because identity is more than a label. It restores a person to the historical record. It allows a family to connect the disappearance with a confirmed fate. And it prevents an individual from becoming nothing more than an unidentified victim in an old investigation. The continued work surrounding the case also shows that justice and closure are not identical. The surviving participants were prosecuted. Henley received multiple life sentences. Brooks was also convicted for his involvement. The legal system had therefore addressed the responsibility of the people who remained alive. But the legal process could not restore the victims. It could not return their lost years to their families. And it could not erase the uncertainty that had existed before the investigation exposed the truth. Corll himself never faced a trial. His death meant that the justice system could not formally impose a sentence upon him. His responsibility was established through the evidence uncovered after his death, rather than through a courtroom verdict against him. This created an unusual structure to the case. The most notorious figure was absent from the courtroom. The surviving participants faced prosecution. The victims could not speak. And investigators had to reconstruct the story from evidence, statements, records, and later forensic work. The result was not a perfect reconstruction of every moment. It was a documented understanding built from what could be established. That distinction is important because notorious cases often attract speculation. When a case is as disturbing as the Corll murders, unanswered questions can encourage people to imagine explanations that go beyond the evidence. But the responsible approach is different. What is known should remain separate from what is uncertain. What is established should not be confused with what is merely possible. The confirmed history is already severe enough. Corll was associated with numerous killings involving young victims. Brooks and Henley played significant roles. The investigation after Corll's death uncovered remains at multiple locations. Many victims were eventually identified. Surviving participants were convicted. And forensic identification continued decades later. Those facts form the foundation of the case. Everything beyond them requires caution. That caution also matters when considering the question of additional victims. The existence of unidentified remains has meant that questions about the full extent of the crimes have continued. But an unresolved identity is not automatically proof of another victim. An unexplained disappearance is not automatically evidence of Corll's involvement. A responsible account must leave those distinctions intact. This is particularly important for the families of people whose cases remain unresolved. Speculation can create another form of uncertainty. The most respectful approach is to acknowledge what investigators established while recognizing the limits of what remains unknown. In that sense, the Corll case became an example of the importance of evidence over mythology. The nickname Candyman became memorable. The number of victims became shocking. The story of a secret network operating for years became part of criminal history. But beneath the mythology were real people. And beneath the mystery were families who needed answers. The case also changed the way the disappearances could be remembered. Before the investigation, a missing young person was simply missing. After the investigation, some families could finally understand that their loved one had been part of a much larger tragedy. That knowledge could never undo the loss, but it could restore the truth. And truth was something the families had been denied for years. The deeper lesson is therefore not that evil is always invisible. It is that information can be fragmented. A warning can exist without being recognized. A disappearance can appear isolated. A piece of evidence can seem meaningless until another piece gives it context. The Corll investigation demonstrated what happens when those pieces finally come together. The discovery did not make the earlier years disappear. It made them understandable. The families could look back and understand why their loved ones had never returned. Investigators could look back and recognize the connections. History could look back and see a pattern that had once been hidden. But the victims cannot look back. Their futures had already been taken from them. That is why the central lesson of the case must remain focused on them. The crimes were not important because they made Dean Corll famous. They were important because young people lost their lives and families lost children. The investigation mattered because it restored identities. The convictions mattered because surviving participants were held accountable. The later forensic work mattered because it continued the effort to identify those who had remained unknown. And the historical record matters because forgetting the victims would create a second loss. The Corll case therefore leaves behind more than a criminal timeline. It leaves a warning about how easily separate tragedies can remain disconnected. It leaves a reminder of the importance of carefully investigating missing person cases. It leaves evidence of how forensic science can continue the work of earlier investigators. And above all, it leaves the names and memories of young people whose lives should not be reduced to the crimes that ended them. The story began with people disappearing. It became visible after a confrontation on August 8, 1973. It expanded into one of Houston's most disturbing investigations. And long after the courtroom proceedings, the work of identification and remembrance continued. That may be the most enduring truth of the case. The investigation could uncover what had happened. The courts could impose sentences. Forensic science could restore identities. But only memory could ensure that the victims remained more than numbers. And that responsibility continues long after the evidence has been cataloged and the courtroom doors have closed. The story of Dean Corll is often remembered as a story about a killer. But that is not where it should end. It should end with the people who disappeared. For years, the young people connected to the case existed in the lives of their families as missing sons, missing friends, missing children whose absence had never been explained. Their names appeared in reports and memories, but the full truth remained hidden. Then, in August 1973, everything changed. Dean Corll was dead. The information that followed led investigators toward locations connected to the crimes. The discoveries revealed that the disappearances were not isolated incidents. They were part of something much larger. The investigation that followed became one of the most serious criminal investigations in Houston's history. Yet, even after the discoveries, prosecutions, and convictions, the story did not truly end. Some victims had to be identified. Some identities could not be established immediately. Some families had to wait. And some questions remained unresolved for decades. That is why the legacy of the Corll case cannot be measured only by the moment when the crimes were exposed. It must also be measured by what happened afterward. The commonly cited number of victims is at least 28, while some accounts refer to 29 depending on how unidentified remains and related cases are counted. Behind that difference is something profoundly human. Each number represents a person. Each person had a name. And each name represented a life that existed before the investigation ever began. The victims were not born into the history of Dean Corll. They were pulled into it by circumstances they did not choose. They had families who knew them as sons and friends who knew them as people with ordinary hopes and futures. Those futures disappeared with them. For many families, the first tragedy was not knowing. A child did not return. There was no explanation. There was no certainty. Only the question of where the person had gone. That question could remain for years. The discovery of the remains changed that. But discovering remains was only the beginning. Investigators still had to determine who the victims were. That process could be complicated by the limitations of forensic science in the 1970s. The technology available at the time could not provide the kind of identification that modern DNA testing can sometimes achieve. As a result, some victims remained unidentified. The passage of time did not necessarily erase those cases. Instead, later technology created opportunities to revisit them. Stephen Sickman's case is one example. He disappeared in 1972. Decades later, in 2011, DNA testing confirmed his identity. That identification came almost 40 years after his disappearance. For anyone looking at the case today, the date difference is difficult to comprehend. Between those years was an entire lifetime of uncertainty. But the identification demonstrated something important. An old investigation can continue to produce answers. Evidence that could not provide a name in one era may become useful in another. The work of investigators does not always end when the first investigation closes. Sometimes it is continued by people who inherit the unanswered questions. Sometimes technology provides the missing piece. And sometimes the answer arrives after decades. For a family, that answer can be painful, but it can also be necessary. A person who has been missing can finally be recognized. A name can be connected to evidence. The uncertainty can finally end. The Coral case, therefore, became part of a broader history of forensic identification. It showed how advances in science can change the understanding of old crimes. But it also showed the limits of science. Not every question can be answered. Not every unidentified person can immediately be named. And not every disappearance can responsibly be attributed to the same offender. Those distinctions matter. A case as notorious as Coral's can easily attract speculation. People may look at unexplained disappearances from the same period and wonder whether they were connected. But wondering is not proof. A responsible historical account must remain grounded in established evidence. The confirmed facts are already extraordinary. Coral was connected to numerous killings. Brooks and Hemley were involved in the network surrounding him. Hemley's confrontation with Coral brought the crimes to light. Investigators discovered remains at multiple locations. Many victims were identified. Brooks and Hemley were prosecuted and convicted. And later forensic work continued to identify victims. That is enough. There is no need to turn uncertainty into certainty. There is no need to assign a victim to a crime without evidence. And there is no need to exaggerate the known facts to understand the seriousness of what happened. The reality is already devastating. The case also demonstrates how much depends on the connection between missing person investigations and homicide investigations. Before the crimes were exposed, the families of missing young people had their own individual stories. After the investigation began, some of those stories became connected. The missing young people were no longer separate cases. Their names became part of a larger investigation. That connection gave investigators a way to understand what had happened. It also gave families something they had not had before: an explanation. But explanation is not the same as restoration. Nothing could restore the years that had been lost. Nothing could return the victims to their families. Nothing could give them the futures they should have had. The legal system could punish surviving participants. It could not reverse the crime. That limitation is present in every homicide investigation. Justice can establish responsibility. It cannot resurrect the dead. The Coral case makes that reality especially visible because the central offender died before he could be prosecuted. Coral would never sit in a courtroom. He would never hear the evidence presented against him. He would never receive a sentence. His death meant that the justice system dealt with the surviving participants instead. Hemley received multiple life sentences after convictions related to the killings. Brooks was also convicted for his involvement. Those convictions were important. They established that the surviving participants would face consequences for their actions. But they could not provide the kind of courtroom ending that many major criminal cases eventually receive. The most notorious figure in the investigation was absent from the trial. His crimes had to be reconstructed through evidence and testimony rather than through a prosecution of Coral himself. That unusual structure is one reason the case remains so striking. The investigation began to reveal its full scale only after the person at its center was already dead. The discovery of the remains then transformed the meaning of the preceding years. The city could no longer look at the disappearances as unrelated. The families could no longer believe that the missing young people might simply return. The investigators could no longer treat the case as a single isolated killing. Everything had changed. And yet the most important people in the story were still the victims. Their lives should not disappear beneath the notoriety of the offender. That is a risk in every famous criminal case. The more notorious the offender becomes, the easier it becomes to remember the offender's name while forgetting the people who suffered. The Coral case should resist that tendency. The young people involved were not statistics. They were not evidence. They were not merely entries in a list of victims. They were individuals. Their families knew them before the crimes. Their friends remembered them before the investigation. Their lives had meaning independent of what happened to them. The responsibility of history is to preserve that distinction. The case can be studied without glorifying the offender. The investigation can be discussed without turning violence into entertainment. The evidence can be examined without losing sight of the people behind it. And the victims can be remembered without reducing them to the circumstances of their deaths. That may be the most important lesson of all. The Coral case demonstrates that an investigation is ultimately about people. Police collect evidence because someone has been harmed. Forensic specialists identify remains because someone deserves to have their identity restored. Prosecutors pursue convictions because someone must be held responsible. Families continue searching because someone they love has disappeared. Every part of the process begins with a human life. The case also shows why unresolved cases should not simply be forgotten. The identification of Stephen Sickman decades after his disappearance demonstrates that answers can come long after the original investigation. The passage of time does not automatically eliminate the importance of the truth. Sometimes the search continues because one missing name still matters. One family still matters. One unanswered question still matters. And even when an investigation cannot resolve every uncertainty, the effort itself has meaning. The Coral case, therefore, has no simple ending. There was the death of Coral. There were the discoveries. There were the convictions. There were later identifications. And there were questions that remained. But perhaps the most honest ending is not to pretend that everything was resolved. Some facts are established. Some identities were confirmed. Some questions remain. The responsibility is to preserve those distinctions. The story of Dean Coral began with young people disappearing. It became visible only after the confrontation that ended Coral's life. It expanded into a massive investigation. It entered the courts. And it continued through decades of forensic work. But the final chapter belongs to the victims. Their names are more important than the nickname given to their killer. Their lives are more important than the number used to describe the case. Their families are more important than the mythology surrounding the investigation. And their memory is more lasting than the man who tried to erase them. Dean Coral died on August 8, 1973. The investigation continued. The legal proceedings followed. The forensic work continued for decades. And the questions did not all disappear. But the truth that emerged after his death ensured that many of the young people who had vanished would no longer be remembered simply as missing. They became identified victims. Their families received answers. Their stories became part of the historical record. And although nothing could undo what happened, remembering them accurately remains one of the few things that can be carried forward. The case is now history. But history is not only about the people who committed crimes. It is also about the people whose lives were taken. That is where the story should remain. The death of Dean Coral on August 8, 1973, ended the life of the man at the center of the investigation. It did not end the investigation itself. In many ways, it was only the beginning of the moment when the hidden scale of the crimes could finally be understood. Before that day, the disappearances of young people existed as separate tragedies. Families waited for sons who never returned. Friends remembered people who had suddenly vanished. Investigators worked with individual reports and limited information. Then Coral was killed. The information that followed opened the door to a much larger story. Investigators discovered remains at locations connected to the case. Names from missing person reports began to acquire new significance. The relationship between Coral, David Owen Brooks, and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. became central to understanding how the crimes had been carried out. The investigation revealed a pattern that had remained hidden for years. But the discovery did not provide a perfect ending. It created another series of questions. Who were all of the victims? Could every set of remains be identified? Was the commonly cited number of victims complete? And how many families had spent years waiting without knowing what had happened? Those questions explain why the case continued to matter long after the original investigation. The commonly cited number is at least 28 victims, while some accounts use 29 depending on how unidentified remains and related cases are counted. That difference is more than a technical disagreement. It reflects the difficulty of assigning a final number when some identities remain uncertain. A criminal case can have a known beginning and still have an incomplete ending. That is what happened here. The investigation established a horrifying pattern. It established the involvement of surviving participants. It established multiple locations connected to the discovery of victims. And it established the identities of many of those who had disappeared. But not every question disappeared with those discoveries. Some identities required decades of additional work. Stephen Sickman's identification provides a clear example. Sickman disappeared in 1972. For many years, his case remained unresolved. Then, in 2011, DNA testing confirmed his identity. Nearly 4 decades had passed. The technology had changed. The investigation had become history. But the question of identity had remained. His identification demonstrated that the search for answers does not necessarily end when the first investigators leave the case behind. Modern forensic science can sometimes reopen doors that earlier investigators could not pass through. Evidence that could not produce a definitive identity in the 1970s could become meaningful decades later. That is an important lesson in the history of unsolved and partially solved cases. Time does not always erase evidence. Sometimes time brings better tools. But even when science succeeds, the emotional meaning of an identification remains complicated. For a family, learning the truth after decades can bring relief because uncertainty has finally ended. It can also bring renewed grief because the possibility of a different outcome is finally gone. There is no simple emotional response. There is only the reality of knowing. That reality is what many families connected to the Coral investigation had wanted from the beginning. They wanted to know where their children were. They wanted their children to be found. They wanted the unanswered question to stop controlling their lives. The investigation eventually provided answers for many of them, but the answers could not restore what had been lost. This is the limit of criminal justice. A court can determine responsibility. A sentence can impose punishment. An investigation can uncover evidence. Forensic science can establish identity. None of those things can return a victim to the people who loved them. The surviving participants faced the legal consequences of their involvement. Henley was convicted in connection with multiple killings and received multiple life sentences. Brooks was also prosecuted and convicted for his involvement. Those convictions became part of the legal conclusion of the case. But Coral himself never faced trial. His death meant that the central offender was beyond the reach of the courtroom. The evidence against him was therefore established through the investigation and the discoveries that followed his death rather than through a prosecution in which he could personally stand as a defendant. That unusual ending has shaped the way the case has been remembered. The man whose name became synonymous with the crimes was never sentenced by a judge. Instead, the record of what investigators found after his death became the basis for understanding his role. The surviving participants became the subjects of prosecution. The victims became the focus of identification. And the families became the people left to live with the consequences. Those different paths continued long after the original investigation. For the families, there was no final courtroom moment that could close the story. There was only the slow process of learning, mourning, remembering, and sometimes waiting for identification. For investigators, there was the challenge of reconstructing events from evidence that had survived the passage of time. For forensic specialists, there was the possibility that modern technology could answer questions that had remained unresolved. And for historians, there was the responsibility to separate established facts from speculation. That final responsibility is especially important. The Coral case has become notorious, and notorious cases often generate stories that extend beyond the evidence. There may be questions about additional victims. There may be unexplained disappearances from the same period. There may be theories about events that investigators could never conclusively connect to Coral. But an unresolved question is not the same thing as an established fact. The responsible account must preserve that difference. What is known is already enough. Coral was responsible for a large number of killings involving young victims. Brooks and Henley played significant roles in the network surrounding him. Henley's confrontation with Coral led to Coral's death and ultimately helped expose the crimes. Investigators then discovered remains at multiple locations. Many victims were identified. The surviving participants were prosecuted and convicted. And later forensic work continued to identify victims. Those facts tell a story that requires no exaggeration. They reveal the scale of the tragedy without turning uncertainty into certainty. They also remind us that the most important part of a true crime story is not the mystery. It is the people. The young people who disappeared were not born as victims. They became victims because their lives were taken from them. Before that happened, they were sons, friends, members of families, and individuals with futures ahead of them. The investigation can tell us when they disappeared. It can tell us where evidence was discovered. It can tell us how the case was eventually exposed. But those facts do not fully describe who those young people were. Their identities existed before the crimes. That is why remembering their names matters. A number can communicate scale. A name communicates individuality. The difference is important. When a case becomes famous, there is always a danger that the offender becomes the central character. The killer's name becomes familiar. The nickname becomes memorable. The investigation becomes a story about the criminal mind. But the victims can gradually disappear from public attention. The Coral case should be remembered differently. The offender should not become more important than the people he killed. The victims should remain at the center. Their families should remain part of the story. And the later identification work should be understood as an effort to restore what disappearance had taken away. A name. An identity. An answer. That is why the discovery of the victims mattered. It was not simply evidence against Coral. It was the beginning of recognition for people who had been missing. The same principle explains why the later DNA identification of Stephen Sickman mattered. His name could finally be connected to the evidence. His disappearance could finally be placed within the known history of the case. And his family could finally have an answer that had been unavailable for decades. But even then, the story remained incomplete. Other questions persisted. Other identities remained uncertain. The exact boundaries of the victim count remained complicated. The investigation had reached far, but it could not erase every unknown. That is often the reality of old criminal cases. There is a temptation to believe that once investigators discover the truth, everything becomes clear. Real investigations are rarely so simple. They produce answers. They also produce new questions. They establish facts. They reveal gaps. They provide closure for some families while leaving others waiting. The Coral investigation illustrates all of those realities at once. It also illustrates the importance of recognizing patterns. The disappearances had occurred over time. The families did not necessarily know one another. The information available to investigators was limited. And the technology of the early 1970s made it much harder to connect separate cases than it is today. Once the connection became visible, however, the meaning of those disappearances changed forever. The city could look back and understand that the young people had not simply vanished into unrelated circumstances. Many had become victims of the same criminal network. The discovery came too late to save them, but it was not too late to establish the truth. That distinction matters. Truth cannot change the past, but it can change what is remembered. It can restore a name. It can answer a family. It can establish responsibility. And it can prevent a victim from being forgotten. That is perhaps the final meaning of the Dean Coral case. It is not only a story about how a hidden series of killings was exposed. It is a story about what happens after the truth is discovered. The investigation continues. The identities are established. The courts impose consequences. Forensic science revisits old evidence. Families carry their grief. And history attempts to remember accurately. Dean Coral died in 1973. But the consequences of his crimes continued for decades. The legal proceedings continued after his death. The identification of victims continued long after the original discoveries. The questions surrounding the case remained part of criminal history, and the families continued to live with what had been revealed. The case, therefore, has no ending that can truly be called complete. There is only a point where the available evidence stops. Beyond that point are questions that must remain questions unless new evidence provides answers. That is not a failure of history. It is an acknowledgement of its limits. The most respectful way to remember the case is to tell the truth about what is known and to refuse to invent certainty where none exists. The victims deserve that accuracy. Their families deserve that respect. And their lives deserve to be remembered as more than numbers in a criminal case. The story of Dean Corll began with disappearances. It was exposed through a confrontation on August 8, 1973. It expanded through the discovery of remains and the investigation that followed. It continued through prosecutions, convictions, forensic identifications, and decades of unanswered questions. But the final image should not be Dean Corll. It should be the names of the young people who were lost. Because long after the offender was gone, their families remained. Long after the courtroom proceedings ended, questions remained. Long after the original investigators completed their work, forensic science continued searching for answers. And long after the case became part of criminal history, the people at its center remained human beings whose lives had mattered. That is the part of the story that should never disappear. The names should remain. The families should remain. The truth should remain. And the victims should never become merely numbers in the shadow of the man who killed them.